Daphné Huard-Boudreault was born in 1998 in Quebec, Canada. While she was still in school, her parents separated, so she spent her childhood in two homes. Despite the divorce, both parents remained present in her life. From an early age, Daphné was adaptable, empathetic, and remarkably skilled at soothing conflicts. She longed for harmony in her family, friendships, and relationships. Even as a teenager, she expressed dreams of working in psychology and helping people who struggled emotionally. By age 18, Daphné had graduated high school and was preparing for the next stage, choosing her profession and living independently. She already had a part-time job at a small store to feel financially free. On the outside, she seemed confident, but those close to her knew she was fragile. Anthony Pratte-Lops, on the other hand, was born in Quebec but was placed under youth protection almost immediately after birth. By the age of 18 months, he had already lived in 3 different foster homes. He had been taken from his biological parents due to severe neglect, lack of basic care, and developmental risks. These early traumas left deep, lasting wounds. Later evaluations concluded that his capacity to form healthy emotional attachments had been severely damaged, though social services attempted to give him stability. The constant upheaval during critical years only worsened his condition. His early development was marked by explosive aggression, unpredictable behavior. Even in preschool, he struggled to form bonds with other children. He was distrustful, tense around adults, perceived emotional closeness as a threat. As a teenager, teachers complained about his behavior, and youth workers noticed he often had difficulty communicating. Beneath his anger was a profound fear of abandonment, a fear that shaped every relationship he entered, making them unstable from the beginning. For him, breakups were not a normal part of life. They were catastrophic losses. As he grew older, he became better at hiding his inner volatility, but he never learned to manage it. Outwardly, he seemed quiet and reserved, but inside, he remained the same frightened child who never understood why he had been given away and what he needed to do to prevent it from happening again. This emotional immaturity, hidden behind an adult facade, made his reactions unpredictable. As an adult, he had numerous encounters with law enforcement. Erratic behavior, disregard for rules, and hostility toward those in authority. Police records noted that he could react dangerously in stressful situations and recommended caution when dealing with him. Though these warnings resulted in no long-term supervision or structured support, in February 2015, Daphné met Anthony. She was 16, he was 20. The connection quickly developed into a romantic relationship. Daphné was finishing high school and still uncertain about her long-term plans. Yet she yearned for independence and the feeling of entering adulthood. To her, dating an older man seemed like a step toward maturity. Anthony was very attentive. He messaged, called her often, inviting her places. In the beginning, he appeared caring, invested, almost overly devoted. For Daphné, who naturally trusted others and always tried to see the good in people, his attention felt genuine. To those around them, the relationship appeared harmless at first. Few noticed the subtle red flags that were already forming beneath the surface. Daphné's parents had been uneasy about Anthony from the very beginning. He rarely visited their home and, when he did, he appeared guarded, tense, uncomfortable. Still, they chose not to forbid the relationship outright. Daphné was no longer a child, and they wanted to respect her autonomy. Believing she was capable of making her own choices, she reassured them repeatedly that everything was fine, leaving out the more troubling aspects of the relationship. For the first few months, things seemed calm. They spent time together, made plans for the future. Anthony pushed the idea that once Daphné turned 18, they should get their own apartment and live together. He insisted they were ready to be independent, that they could handle adult life as a team. Although she hesitated, Daphné slowly gave in. She liked being seen as someone mature enough to build a life with an older partner. And because he made her feel valued, she was aware he wasn't steadily employed and mostly lived on welfare. But she didn't focus on it. He said health issues kept him from working and that it wouldn't last forever. Even though she paid most of their expenses, she wasn't worried about it. During this period, Anthony began showing possessive behaviors, though not yet openly aggressive ones. He was jealous of her classmates and acquaintances, reacted strongly to social media messages, asked endless questions about people from her past. Occasionally, he told her to stop talking to anyone he believed didn't respect their relationship. It seemed like ordinary jealousy, nothing extreme, at least not yet. Looking back, the winter and spring of 2015 were likely the calmest months of their entire relationship. Neither Daphné nor her family understood how unstable and dangerous Anthony truly was. From the outside, their romance appeared like a typical teenage relationship filled with excitement, dreams. But the early signs were already there: dependency, control, and shrinking personal boundaries. Bit by bit, Daphné noticed her independence slipping away, replaced by constant efforts to adjust to his moods. Each month, she bent a little more, setting aside her own needs. She convincing herself that love meant patience, understanding. When Daphné turned 18, she moved into a small rented apartment with Anthony. Her parents strongly doubted the decision, but tried to honor her choices. The apartment wasn't far from her hometown, which created an illusion of safety. Daphné wanted to prove that she could handle adult life, manage responsibilities, and build a real relationship. But everyday reality quickly revealed a truth she had never seen. Living with Anthony was far more difficult than she expected. He didn't work or attend school and spent most of his time isolated in the apartment. Against that backdrop, his bursts of jealousy, anger escalated. He demanded constant attention, questioned her every move, monitored her phone, and scrutinized her conversations. His mood swung wildly, from intense affection to explosive rage. Any attempt by Daphné to go out alone or meet with friends ignited resentment or aggression. He wanted full control. Even short phone calls could spark arguments. Soon, he criticized everything: her clothes, her tone of voice, even small habits she never thought twice about. Anything could be turned into a fight. The practical and financial responsibility fell entirely on Daphné. She worked to pay rent, buy groceries, manage the household, and hold everything together. But the emotional pressure only intensified. Anthony repeatedly reminded her of his past and his life attempt and used it as a weapon to keep her close. He insisted he couldn't survive without her. These manipulative threats guilt-trip Daphné, making her believe she is responsible for his happiness. The first serious rupture came when Daphné finally gathered the courage to end the relationship. She told Anthony she wanted to break up and began packing her belongings. His reaction was immediate and explosive. He tore through the apartment in a blind rage, smashing objects, hurling her personal items, ripping cushions, breaking furniture. The noise was so loud that neighbors called the police. Officers arrived, documented the scene, and ordered him to calm down. But despite the destruction, Anthony wasn't arrested. He received only a warning. Daphné's parents rushed over as soon as they heard what had happened. They helped her pack what was left of her things and took her back home. She moved through the apartment in silence, stunned by how quickly everything had turned violent. Although she tried to appear composed, she was deeply shaken. Her parents worried about her emotional state. Sensing the inner conflict she wouldn't speak about, she was devastated. Realizing the relationship she had invested so much in was already collapsing. At this time, Anthony called, wrote, and sent long messages, begging, blaming stress, promising change. He insisted he wasn't angry, just desperate. Soon, he shifted to emotional manipulation, telling her he couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and was thinking about ending his life. He insisted she had abandoned him at the worst moment, that he needed her now more than ever. The guilt wore her down. Despite her fear, disappointment, and the frightening incident in the apartment, she couldn't cut him off completely. Pity and worry over his threats blurred the line between affection and responsibility. At 18, she didn't yet understand the difference between love and emotional dependency. Her parents tried to convince her not to return, but they avoided pushing too hard. They couldn't forbid her from contacting him. However, persuasion wasn't enough. Reluctantly, she returned, hoping to rebuild what they once had. But nothing improved. Moments of calm were quickly replaced by suspicion and the need for control. Anthony resumed monitoring her messages, demanding explanations for every absence, every conversation. Daphne began withdrawing. She stayed quiet, avoided confrontations, and stopped sharing her struggles with her family. Her self-confidence eroded. She was terrified that leaving him again might trigger another crisis or worse. Yet she also felt the relationship hollowing her out from the inside. Anthony sensed he was regaining power. He no longer needed visible aggression. His tactics shifted toward dependency. He used insults, silent treatments, and accusations of betrayal. Whenever she tried to express a thought or assert herself, he turned it into an attack. He insisted he couldn't survive without her, that something terrible would happen to him if she ever walked away. It became a psychological trap, caught between fear, pity, guilt, and hope. Daphne lost her ability to see the situation clearly. She lived in a constant state of tension, convinced she couldn't leave without causing him irreversible harm. Her attempt to save someone she cared about slowly cost her control over her own life. In March 2017, Daphne is determined to end her relationship with Anthony. She had already tried to rebuild this relationship too many times. This time, she simply packed her belongings, left their shared apartment, and didn't look back. For the next few days, she alternated between her mother's home and her father's, taking advantage of their separate households to avoid staying in one place for too long. Anthony refused to accept that the breakup was final. To him, this was just another temporary withdrawal, something she had done before and eventually reversed. He continued sending her messages every day, shifting between desperate pleas for her to come back and angry accusations of betrayal. He called repeatedly, but Daphne never answered. When he could no longer reach her directly, he began contacting her parents, texting her mother to ask where she was. But he received no reply. Soon, he turned to her friends and acquaintances, asking if they knew where she was staying. He monitored her social media activity, checking when she appeared online. His efforts to reach her became increasingly intrusive. Relentless, Daphne eventually shut off her phone entirely, knowing that any response, no matter how small, would pull her back into the same destructive cycle. Anthony then began using intermediaries. He asked acquaintances to drive past her parents' homes to check if her car was there, searched for any opportunity to corner her into a meeting. Her silence wasn't a rejection in his eyes. It was merely a temporary obstacle he needed to overcome. Around this time, Anthony discovered that Daphne had begun seeing another young man, Alexis, her co-worker. He didn't know the details, but the idea alone was enough to push him into a dangerous emotional spiral. He felt humiliated, abandoned, and replaced. To him, Daphne hadn't simply left. She had betrayed him. Rejection was something he had never been able to process. Now, his agitation grew deeper, darker, and more volatile. Driven by anger and wounded pride, Anthony recorded a video message, posted it online. The video lasted several minutes. In it, he accused Daphne of destroying his life, said she had used him, manipulated him, and thrown him away. He insisted he loved her more than anyone ever would, yet she supposedly didn't appreciate it. While he made no explicit threats, The emotional volatility was unmistakable. He looked furious, unhinged. When Daphne's family discovered the video, they were horrified. Her father couldn't understand why the platform had not removed it immediately. To see the man who terrified his daughter publicly attacking her, without consequence, was deeply unsettling. But more importantly, the video exposed the truth. Anthony was in a dangerous mental state, driven by obsession, jealousy. In the final days before the tragedy, fear hovered over everything. Daphné sensed that Anthony wanted to confront her, but she tried not to show it. She didn't want to frighten her parents or burden them with her anxiety. She believed that staying calm, not reacting, and keeping her distance would prevent him from escalating. She didn't know how far he was willing to go. On the cold, snowy night of March 20, 2017, Anthony made his move. Around 11 o'clock p.m., he left his home in Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu and began walking toward Boucherville, where Daphné was staying with her father. He had no car, so he trudged through freezing temperatures and unplowed streets on foot. The walk took nearly 2 hours. This wasn't an impulsive decision. Around 1 o'clock a.m., he arrived at the property. Keeping out of sight, he slipped into the back seat of a car parked in the driveway. It wasn't Daphné's own vehicle. It was her mother's car, lent to her while hers was being repaired. Anthony knew she would drive this car to work in the morning. Around 10:30 a.m., on March 21, 2017, Daphné quietly stepped out of her father's house to head to work. She walked toward the car her mother had lent her, only to freeze when she opened the door. Anthony was sitting in the back seat, motionless, waiting. He said he only wanted to talk. He repeated that they needed to clear things up, refusing to leave the car. Shocked and already running late for her shift, Daphné tried calmly asking him to get out, but he wouldn't move. Unable to force him out and wanting to avoid escalation, she got behind the wheel, drove, with Anthony silently riding along in the back seat. He didn't touch her. He didn't raise his voice. But Daphné felt the tension, his hidden intentions. When they arrived at the small grocery store where she worked, Daphné quickly got out of the car and went inside. Anthony followed her. Her co-workers immediately noticed his behavior. Tense, fixated, standing too close, watching her every move. The atmosphere grew increasingly unsettling, concerned. Her colleagues called the police. Officers arrived shortly afterward and confirmed that Anthony's behavior was intrusive, worrisome. They separated him from Daphné, escorted him outside, and spoke with him privately. He didn't show aggression, but he was clearly emotionally unstable. When officers asked if she wanted to file a complaint, Daphné declined. She insisted she wasn't afraid, that he hadn't laid a hand on her, hadn't threatened her, that she didn't want to escalate the situation. She told them she had everything under control. So the police issued only a verbal warning. Anthony then called a taxi and left. Afterward, Daphné returned to her shift, exhausted but determined to keep going. She wanted to believe it was over, that this was just another unpleasant episode she would eventually move past. She didn't consider herself in danger, but for Anthony, that morning was not the end. It was preparation. He had not let go. Over the next hours, Daphné stuck to her strategy of silent distance, thinking that if she ignored him and refused to react, he would eventually give up. The next day, March 22, 2017, Daphné decided to go to Anthony's apartment to collect the last of her belongings. What drove her to act was fear for her pets, her cat and 2 lizards. She worried he might neglect them or harm them out of spite. Before leaving, she went to the police station. She explained her situation, told them she needed to pick up her things, and admitted she didn't feel safe. Because Anthony was already known to police for instability, the officer she spoke to strongly advised her not to go alone. A female officer was assigned to quietly accompany her. following in a separate vehicle so as not to provoke Anthony but still close enough to intervene if necessary. They arrived at the building around noon. As Daphné entered the building, the policewoman waited outside. After waiting longer than expected without seeing Daphné return, the policewoman quickly followed. However, she mistakenly entered the wrong section of the complex. After several minutes of double-checking the address, she finally found the correct entrance and floor. Unfortunately, this delay had serious consequences. When she got to the apartment door, everything was silent. She knocked, but no one answered. Then, she saw a shadow move behind the glass, and a man's voice said, "Arrest me." The door opened. Anthony stood there, expression blank, hands soaked in blood. "This isn't my blood," he said flatly. The officer immediately ordered him to step out. He complied without resistance. His demeanor was eerily calm. The officer called for backup and an ambulance, then entered the apartment. It was silent inside. Near the stairs, she found Daphné's body on the floor. She was dead. Later, forensic analysis revealed she had suffered 15 stab wounds, most concentrated around her chest and neck. Her throat had also been slashed. One of the wounds alone would have been fatal. The rest reflected a frenzy, the kind of violent outburst committed by someone in a state of overwhelming rage. The time wasted finding the right building and entrance led to tragic consequences. Although law enforcement acted according to procedure, this situation highlighted a critical reality. When confronting a potentially dangerous individual, even a minor delay can have fatal consequences. The crime scene clearly showed what happened. Blood was splattered throughout the apartment. Bloody handprints marked the leg of a table. A partial shoe print smeared the lower portion of the door. The attacker didn't try to hide anything. Anthony was arrested immediately and taken to the police station. There, he confessed without hesitation. He did not deny what he had done, nor did he attempt to justify it. He said only that he had crossed a line and that it happened fast. He provided no additional explanation, nor did he show any remorse. Physically, he appeared stable. He had no visible injuries and declined medical treatment. As interrogations began, news of the killing reached Daphné's family. Her father was the first to receive the call, asking him to come to the police station. When he arrived, the truth was revealed. His daughter was dead. The shock was overwhelming. Daphné's mother collapsed emotionally, struggling to process what she was hearing. Her father sat in disbelief, unable to comprehend that the danger they had feared for months had now become reality. They learned that Anthony had confessed and was in custody. The family was initially instructed to stay away from the crime scene while technicians worked. Her father refused. He insisted on seeing his daughter, an image that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The investigation progressed quickly after Anthony's arrest. With his confession on record and the evidence overwhelming, the case proceeded to trial in 2019. He was ultimately convicted and sentenced to life in prison, with no eligibility for parole for the first 18 years. But public attention soon shifted toward a controversial aspect of the legal process. Prosecutors and defense attorneys reached a plea deal, reducing the charge to second-degree murder on the grounds that premeditation couldn't be conclusively proven. Under Canadian law, this meant the killing was classified as intentional but not planned. For Daphné's family, this was devastating. Her father firmly believed the crime was premeditated. He pointed to Anthony's actions, waiting for her in the car, tracking her movements, posting disturbing messages online, and committing the murder within minutes of her entering the apartment. None of this, he argued, aligned with a spontaneous crime of passion. To him, these were unmistakable signs of preparation, of first-degree murder. After the funeral, the family sought support from the Crime Victims' Compensation Office to cope with the emotional and financial impact of their loss. But their initial application was rejected. According to the agency, since the parents had not been physically harmed themselves, they were not considered direct victims under the law and were therefore not eligible for compensation. The family appealed the decision, and after a lengthy process, the appeal was successful. The original decision was overturned. The parents received some compensation, primarily to help with the costs of psychological counseling and lost wages. While the amount of money was not large, it marked an acknowledgement that the system recognized the weight of their loss. At the same time, public attention turned sharply toward the question of police responsibility. The actions of the officers involved on the day of the murder were scrutinized in both media and community discussions. One officer, the one tasked with escorting Daphne to collect her belongings, had mistakenly entered the wrong building and lost several crucial minutes. The second officer, the one who spoke to Daphne on the day of the workplace incident, did not insist on formal accompaniment, even though Anthony's escalating behavior clearly warranted greater protection. Both officers were summoned for a professional ethics review. After internal hearings, neither faced disciplinary consequences. Officially, their actions did not constitute a breach of protocol. For Daphne's family, and especially her father, the outcome was enraging. He publicly condemned the decision, stating that the police had gravely underestimated the risk. Anthony was already known to authorities as emotionally unstable and potentially dangerous. His stalking, his obsessive messages, the online video, and his aggressive behavior at Daphne's workplace were unmistakable warning signs. In the father's view, every one of those signs had been minimized until it was too late. For Daphne's loved ones, the pain has not faded with time. They lost a daughter in the most violent way imaginable, and then had to fight for acknowledgement that her death was not an unavoidable tragedy, but a preventable one. No link in the chain, police, prosecutors, or social services, took responsibility. Daphne's story became a stark symbol in Quebec of how the line between psychological abuse and imminent danger is too often ignored. It is a reminder of how hesitation, procedural gaps, and institutional subjectivity can create deadly consequences. When a young woman suddenly stopped answering her phone and disappeared without a trace, her family immediately knew something was terribly wrong. Police got involved, confident they'd solve the case quickly. After all, she'd been house-sitting in a quiet Michigan neighborhood where nothing unusual ever happened. But what unfolded felt less like a typical missing person case and more like the start of a dark crime story. A car found deep in the woods, a body discovered in a basement, a confession that didn't make sense, and evidence pointing everywhere except where detectives claimed it did. What no one realized then was that this was only the beginning. When the truth finally came out, more than 10 years later, it didn't just devastate her family. It exposed major failures within the justice system and left people across the country in disbelief. To understand how everything went so wrong, we have to return to where it all started, with a young woman named Andrea Eilber. Andrea Eilber was born on April 17, 1991, in Flint, Michigan. Her mother passed away when she was a child, and her father later remarried. The family eventually settled in the small town of Otisville, where Andrea completed high school. After graduating, she took a job at a nearby supermarket. She thought about going to college but was still unsure of a specific direction, so she continued working and saving for the future. At work, she met Kenneth Carl Grondin, a 19-year-old co-worker. The two soon began dating. In November 2011, when Andrea was 20, her aunt and uncle left town and asked her to help house sit. At that time, she was still living with her parents, but decided to temporarily move to her aunt and uncle's house to help look after their home. For the first few days, Kenneth and a friend visited her there. They hung out, watched movies, and enjoyed each other's company. Andrea and Kenneth later made plans to spend the evening of November 14 together. She was supposed to pick him up. But shortly before then, she texted to say she couldn't make it. Instead, she asked him to go to her aunt and uncle's house, bringing some movie DVDs. Kenneth arrived around 7:30 p.m. But the house was dark, locked, and Andrea's car was gone. After knocking with no response, he tried calling her, but she didn't answer. Assuming she had stepped out, he decided to wait. About half an hour later, Andrea texted him again, saying her plans had changed and they would see each other the next day. She didn't explain where she was, and she didn't respond to any more of Kenneth's messages. The next day passed with no word from Andrea. At first, only Kenneth was worried. Since Andrea was staying at her aunt and uncle's house, her father wasn't concerned when he didn't hear from her right away. But after another day without contact, he began to worry. He asked a relative to check on her, and she went to the house with Kenneth. They looked through the windows and walked around but found no one there. Andrea's father started calling her friends, and none had heard from her for over 24 hours. The family began to fear something was wrong and organized a search. Family and friends split into groups, driving through nearby towns, parks, and other places Andrea might have gone. That evening, one of her friends found her car parked in a remote area near a national park. Just a few miles from her relative's home, the car doors were unlocked, the keys were missing, and Andrea was not there. Her father immediately called the police. With Andrea's uncle's consent, the police broke into the house. In the basement, they made a terrible discovery. Andrea was sitting in a chair with a gunshot wound to her head. The medical examiner determined she had been killed by a single gunshot fired from several feet away. She had died 2 days earlier. On the same night, she canceled her plans with Kenneth. The coroner also found marks on Andrea's wrists, indicating she had been bound with plastic tape, although the tape was missing when the body was found. The analysis suggested the ties had been removed 6 or 7 hours after her death, raising the possibility that the killer either returned later or stayed in the house for hours afterward. Investigators noted that some items were missing from the home, but it didn't appear to be a typical burglary. Most valuables were left untouched. The missing items included a bottle of perfume, a sweater, a camera, 3 knives, a rifle, ammunition, and some cash. Jewelry, and even a piece of solid gold in plain sight, were left behind. While crime scene technicians searched the house, detectives learned that Andrea had a boyfriend named Kenneth and went to question him. Kenneth explained when he'd last seen Andrea and willingly gave DNA and fingerprint samples. The police confiscated the clothes he wore that night and searched his home, but found nothing suspicious. Despite this, detectives continued to question Kenneth, and over time they began to suspect that he might be the killer. Kenneth denied the accusation and took a polygraph test, which indicated no signs of deception. He said that on the night of November 14th, Andrea had suddenly canceled their plans, and he had been heartbroken. He assumed she was planning to break up with him. Upset, he went home, charged his phone, and texted a female friend, telling her that he thought Andrea was about to leave him. They messaged for a while, and then Kenneth drove to the store where she worked. The two talked more about the situation, and eventually, she invited him to join her and her roommate for a movie night. Kenneth arrived at their place around 10 p.m., which both women later confirmed. His phone data supported his story, showing his phone connected to a nearby cell tower at that time. About 20 minutes before arriving, a gas station camera caught him on camera. That same night, someone withdrew $300 from Andrea's bank account in the town of Davidson, about a 30-minute drive from her uncle's house. What's noteworthy is that this transaction took place only 7 minutes after Kenneth arrived at his friend's house. Far too short a time for him to have traveled between the two places. Nevertheless, the police have not yet removed him from the list of suspects. Kenneth stayed with his friends until around midnight and then went home. The next morning, He tried calling Andrea several times, but she didn't answer. Worried, he drove to her uncle's house around 10 o'clock a.m. and knocked on the door, but no one answered. He left and was back home by about 11 o'clock a.m., something confirmed by his family and his phone's data. Around that same time, another $300 was withdrawn from Andrea's account, this time in a different, more distant town. Police obtained surveillance footage of the person using the card. The image was too blurry to identify the suspect, but it showed a white pickup truck at the scene. Despite the evidence suggesting Kenneth's innocence, detectives still had doubts. They thought parts of his story didn't make sense. Kenneth admitted that he drove to Andrea's uncle's house around the time of her death and sat in the car outside for about 30 minutes, which struck detectives as odd. On top of that, when Andrea's friends and family organized a search for her on the evening of November 15th, Kenneth said he couldn't join because he had to work early the next day. Later, he told detectives he had already spent the day looking for Andrea and calling her repeatedly, assuming she was ignoring him. He believed she wanted to end the relationship, not that something bad had happened. Another concern arose when a friend of Kenneth's, who was helping with the search, asked for Andrea's uncle's home address. Kenneth gave him the wrong location, about 3 miles from the actual house. Investigators thought this was strange because Kenneth had been there many times before. Although there was still no solid evidence against him, detectives kept pressing. After more than 10 hours of questioning, police claimed Kenneth had confessed. In his affidavit, Kenneth said he went to Andrea's uncle's house that night, entered, and discovered her body in the basement. He said he thought she had hurt herself and decided to stage the crime to look like a murder so her family wouldn't know. He admitted to taking a few items that were nearby but didn't provide many details beyond that. Kenneth's confession was short, unclear, and filled with vague wording. He insisted he hadn't killed Andrea. He only claimed to have found her body. Still, detectives believed they finally had enough evidence and arrested him. As soon as they charged him with murder, Kenneth tried to take back his statement. He explained that detectives had interrogated him for hours, bombarding him with accusations until he was completely worn down. Eventually, they told him that if he wrote down a version of events where he simply discovered Andrea's body, he could go home. Believing them, Kenneth complied. But that statement became the centerpiece of the case against him. Kenneth also said detectives repeatedly deceived him. They claimed to have solid forensic evidence linking him to the crime and told him he had failed the polygraph test miserably. It was later revealed that his grandfather had hired a lawyer and sent a lawyer to the station to help. When the lawyer tried to locate Kenneth, one detective hung up on him and warned others not to disclose Kenneth's whereabouts. The lawyer spent the entire day making calls, but no officer would provide information. Kenneth, unaware that his lawyer was trying to contact him, continued to speak privately with the detectives. He later said his confession was nothing more than him repeating what they told him to say, hoping to finally go home. In truth, Kenneth claimed he didn't even know Andrea was dead. Less than a day after Andrea's body was found, detectives announced they had found a suspect. Kenneth's family and friends refused to believe he was involved, but there was little they could do. Police ended their investigation, convinced his confession would be enough to convict him. Forensic evidence, however, told a different story. Experts tested multiple samples from the crime scene, including skin under Andrea's fingernails. The DNA belonged to an unknown man, not Kenneth. A second sample found in Andrea's car matched the same unidentified person. Then there was Andrea's bank card. Someone had been withdrawing her money, but it wasn't Kenneth. Despite these red flags, detectives claimed to have found new evidence. When one officer opened the sealed bag containing Kenneth's clothes from the night Andrea disappeared, he noticed a single bloody hair stuck to Kenneth's pants. Tests showed that the hair and blood were both Andrea's, but strangely, the pants were completely bloodless. Forensic experts concluded that the hair could have been attached after Andrea died. because if Kenneth had really killed someone while wearing those pants, there would have been blood splatter. Kenneth's lawyer argued that the hair could have been contaminated during the process of collecting evidence. Kenneth's clothes were confiscated only 30 minutes after the body was found, so it is highly likely that the police accidentally got the hair on them while processing the scene. The lawyer also asked the court to dismiss Kenneth's confession, arguing that police had blocked him from seeing his client during questioning. In addition, parts of the interrogation video had mysteriously disappeared. Precisely the moments when, according to Kenneth, detectives were feeding him the answers. The legal battle lasted 4 years before the court finally ruled that the confession would remain admissible. During that time, Kenneth was out on bail but strictly monitored. He wore a GPS ankle tracker and needed police approval to leave his home. When the trial began in 2015, the prosecution relied mainly on 2 pieces of evidence: Kenneth's confession and the bloody hair found on his pants. Their theory was that he had killed Andrea during a robbery. Even though none of the stolen items were found in his possession and her bank card had clearly been used by someone else, the prosecutor tried to explain the inconsistencies by claiming the robbery was staged. He argued that Kenneth killed Andrea to steal her money and property, but also claimed that he had staged the crime scene to create a distraction. This reasoning was weak, especially since Kenneth came from a wealthy family and didn't need the money. The prosecutor also stressed that there was no sign of forced entry and that Kenneth had a spare key to Andrea's uncle's house. Andrea had given it to him just a few days before she died, so he could visit any time. Kenneth, however, insisted he had left the key inside the house 2 days before her death. A friend who was with him at the time confirmed this account, and police later found the spare key exactly where Kenneth had said it would be. The defense argued that the case was filled with inconsistencies and that the investigation was poorly handled. They pointed out a detail the police seemed to overlook: Andrea's car had been taken and later abandoned a few miles from her house. Her father testified that the car constantly leaked oil under the driver's seat, which always left Andrea's shoes stained. By that logic, anyone who drove her car would have oil on their shoes as well. But when investigators examined Kenneth's boots, there wasn't any trace of oil. The prosecutor then changed the theory, suggesting Kenneth had an accomplice. In this version, Kenneth killed Andrea while the accomplice took the stolen items, drove off in her car, and used her bank card. Another major issue for the prosecution was that the murder weapon was never found. Police confirmed that the missing rifle from Andrea's uncle's house and Kenneth's parents' gun did not match the bullet that killed her. Kenneth's lawyer argued that the police had ignored other possible suspects because they were fixated on Kenneth from the start. To support this, the defense presented 5 alternative suspects. At the top of the list was Jeffrey, a mutual acquaintance of Kenneth and Andrea. There were several suspicious details about him. He was the one who conveniently found Andrea's car early in the search, even though it was parked miles away in a secluded area. That same day, he called Kenneth asking about Andrea, even though Kenneth had never given him his phone number. Investigators later learned Andrea had written Kenneth's number on a piece of paper that was found on her nightstand next to a spot where unidentified DNA was recovered. Jeffrey also owned a car that looked very similar to the one caught on surveillance footage when someone used Andrea's bank card at a gas station. Andrea's brother mentioned another possible suspect, a banned substance dealer. He admitted that he had been struggling with addiction and owed the dealer money. According to her brother, the dealer knew Andrea saved money from her job. So, her brother suspects the dealer may have killed her to collect the debt. Police also investigated a young man named David after his father reported that he might have been involved in Andrea's murder. David had a criminal record for car theft and assault and resembled the person seen on the surveillance video using Andrea's bank card. Despite all these leads, detectives said they found no solid evidence connecting any of these suspects to the crime. When the trial ended, the jury deliberated for 2 days before finding Kenneth guilty of first-degree murder. He received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. His attorney immediately filed an appeal. The defense first argued that Kenneth's confession was coerced and that police had denied him legal counsel. But the court rejected those claims. Next, they appealed the robbery conviction, pointing out that Kenneth had also been found guilty of theft, even though none of the stolen items were ever recovered. That appeal also failed. However, in their third attempt, Kenneth's lawyer found a significant error in the jury paperwork. Jurors had been given two separate murder charges to consider: first-degree and second-degree. For the first-degree charge, they could choose between guilty or not guilty. But for second-degree murder, the only option listed was guilty. This meant the jury had no way to find Kenneth not guilty of the lesser charge. They were forced to decide only how guilty he was. The appeals court could not overlook such a major procedural flaw. In 2018, Kenneth was granted a new trial after spending 3 years in prison. Following the ruling, he was released on bail again. His lawyer continued to push for new evidence that could identify the real killer, repeatedly urging police to re-examine the existing DNA samples. In 2022, investigators finally agreed to conduct a new review. At that point, Kenneth's retrial had still not started, and he remained free on bail. Forensic experts reanalyzed all unidentified male DNA connected to the case, but there were still no matches in the FBI database. They then decided to focus on the strongest piece of evidence: a cigarette butt found outside Andrea's uncle's house. This sample matched the same man whose DNA had been found under Andrea's fingernails. Confirming he was the true killer, investigators sent the cigarette butt to Arthrom, a company specializing in genetic genealogy. In January 2023, experts made a breakthrough. By using public genetic databases and tracing family connections, they identified a possible suspect, a 42-year-old man named Chadwick Mobley, who had not appeared in the original investigation. Detectives discovered that Chadwick lived in a town about 40 minutes away from the crime scene when Andrea was murdered. His phone records from November 2011 showed that on the day Andrea was killed, his phone connected to a tower near her aunt and uncle's home 23 times. By 2023, Chadwick was living in Utah, working as a delivery driver and living out of his van. Investigators asked local police to secretly collect an item containing his DNA. But because he often stayed in open areas, surveillance proved difficult. After 2 months of monitoring, officers still hadn't retrieved anything usable, so detectives decided to confront him directly. With a warrant in hand, they approached Chadwick and collected a DNA sample. He denied any involvement, but lab tests soon confirmed his DNA was under Andrea's fingernails, inside her car, and in multiple locations at the crime scene. When police searched his van, they also found a revolver. Ballistic analysis proved it was the weapon used to kill Andrea. 2 days later, police went to follow up, but Chadwick had fled. 3 weeks later, authorities tracked him to Montana near the Canadian border, where he was caught, but while being extradited to Michigan, he escaped from a police car. Despite being handcuffed and shackled, a few days later, a local sheriff spotted him by chance, paddling down a river in a canoe. That led to his second capture. This time, he was successfully brought back to Michigan and placed in custody without bail. As he had already escaped twice, Chadwick pleaded not guilty, and prosecutors began preparing their case. For local law enforcement, it was a humiliating turn of events. After more than a decade of insisting Kenneth was the killer, the new evidence, including DNA under Andrea's fingernails and the murder weapon, now pointed unmistakably to Chadwick. Investigators looked into whether Kenneth and Chadwick had any connection. Maybe they'd worked together or crossed paths? But they found none. The two men were complete strangers, and Andrea didn't know Chadwick either. At the time of her murder, Chadwick was 32 and living in a nearby town with no link to her. Despite all the new evidence, Kenneth's conviction remained in place. He continued to live under strict monitoring, wearing an ankle bracelet. Prosecutors even intensified their efforts. announcing their intention to hold a second trial based on the theory that Kenneth and Chadwick had committed the murder together. That second trial never happened for Chadwick. In February 2025, he entered a no-contest plea, meaning he wouldn't fight the charges but also wouldn't admit guilt. He told the judge he'd been extremely drunk the night Andrea was killed and couldn't remember what had happened. Though he didn't deny being involved, during the hearing, an alarming detail surfaced. Investigators had actually considered Chadwick a suspect early in the case. However, for reasons no one could explain, his name was never officially added to the case file. By then, detectives had already focused on Kenneth. Ignoring the DNA mismatch and the missing murder weapon, Chadwick Mobley was ultimately sentenced to life in prison without parole. In court, he apologized to Andrea's family for Kenneth, though nothing changed. His lawyer immediately requested that the charges be dropped, but prosecutors refused, claiming that Chadwick's conviction didn't rule out Kenneth's involvement. They vowed to proceed with a second trial. Chadwick insisted he didn't know Kenneth or Andrea and had acted alone. Nevertheless, the state continued to pursue the case. The new trial for Kenneth is scheduled for January 2026. He remains under house arrest as his defense team builds his case, supported by a respected forensic expert who re-examined the bloodied hair on Kenneth's pants. The expert confirmed earlier findings that the hair must have ended up there several hours after Andrea's death, not during the murder. Considering all the evidence, the DNA results, the recovered weapon, Chadwick's conviction, and the forensic analysis, Kenneth now has a strong chance of clearing his name. But the toll has been immense. 14 years of his life are gone. Years spent behind bars and confined to his home. Even if the courts finally recognize his innocence, he'll never recover that lost time. And if he decides to seek justice against the officers and prosecutors responsible, that battle could last many more years. With no certainty he'll ever be fully vindicated. When a peaceful family home turns into the scene of a nightmare, everything people believe about safety, justice, and redemption faces its toughest test. On the night after Christmas, in a quiet suburban neighborhood where tragedy was unthinkable, a mother fought desperately to save her children. What investigators later uncovered didn't just shock the community, it sparked a national debate about how well the law protects victims and where it fails. This is the story of a couple who crossed oceans in search of safety, only to face the very horror they thought they had left behind. It's a story of love, courage, and a justice system that made an entire nation ask, how could this happen? To truly understand this tragedy, we must start with the family at its center. Lee and Emma Lovell, best friends who built a love story spanning more than 20 years. Their journey began long before the night their world fell apart. Lee and Emma Lovell had been best friends since their teenage years. When they first met, both were in other relationships, but they quickly realized how much they had in common. They started out as just friends, but after both of them broke up with their partners, they grew closer and realized they were meant to be together. From there, a strong love affair that lasted more than 20 years began. In their early years, they lived and worked in England. Here, they married, had 2 daughters, Scarlett and Cassie, and lived happily together for 12 years. One day, while still in the UK, they heard a news story about an attack on a married couple. They followed the case and were shocked at how lightly the attacker was punished. They felt the justice system favored the criminals over the victims. The experience deeply affected them and motivated them to make a major life change. They decided to move to Australia. They believed it would be a safer, better place to raise their daughters. The Lovells were known for their positivity and hard work. They loved each other deeply and devoted themselves to their family. Lee worked tirelessly to provide for the family, while Emma ran the house and looked after the children. After moving to Australia, they quickly integrated and chose Queensland as their home. Their new life was filled with joy, love, and hope. The family kept in touch with relatives and friends in the UK, and even welcomed visitors. Everything seemed to be going great. However, tragedy struck on the evening of December 26, 2022. That day, the whole family was enjoying the festive atmosphere and preparing for Christmas. Emma baked dumplings, a favorite dish of her husband and children. The whole family was happy and filled with laughter when opening presents. No one could have imagined that their joy would soon be broken. When the day ended, the children went to sleep, and Emma and Lee also went to bed early, tired after the long day. A couple of hours later, around 11:30 p.m., Emma was awakened by a suspicious noise. Their small dog had been acting uneasy all night and began barking. Alarmed, Emma grabbed her phone and checked the home's security cameras. What she saw made her heart race. The front door was open. She alerted Lee immediately. Worried for their daughter's safety, he got up, opened the bedroom door, and found a stranger inside their home. For a moment, they all froze. Then Lee stepped toward the intruder, trying to force him out, just as he threatened to call the police. A sudden, intense pain struck him. Another man had attacked from behind with a knife. Lee collapsed to the floor in pain and confusion as the attackers kicked him. Emma screamed and ran to help her husband. She saw their youngest daughter, Cassie, in the hallway and quickly told Cassie to go back inside and lock the door. Before she could finish, one of the men attacked her as well. She fought back fiercely while Lee, regaining some strength, tried to defend their family. Despite being stabbed several times, Emma kept resisting, desperate to protect her daughters as the violent struggle continued. One of the robbers stabbed Emma again. Her wounded husband, Lee, joined her, and together they managed to force the attackers outside before fleeing the house. Bleeding, Lee immediately turned to his wife to check if she was all right, but quickly realized she was not. Emma weakened and collapsed, barely breathing. The entire left side of her nightgown was soaked with blood. Lying on her back, she stared upward, her eyes wide open. Lee, though seriously injured, remained conscious and called for help. He rushed back into the house, trying to keep their daughters in their rooms so they wouldn't see their mother in such a state. Terrified, Lee phoned emergency services to report the attack. Police and paramedics arrived within minutes. Lee could only give a vague description of the attackers. They were teenagers, one of whom was carrying a large knife. Detectives confirmed this when they checked the kitchen area. All the tools the criminals had brought were still at the scene. Emma lay on the lawn, still alive but badly wounded. Paramedics treated her in the yard before transporting her to the hospital due to the severity of her injuries. Lee was also taken for treatment but suffered only minor wounds. His main concern was Emma and their daughters. He kept asking about her condition and worried that the attackers might return. He urged the police to find them as quickly as possible. After giving his statement to detectives, 43-year-old Lee was told the devastating news. His wife, Emma Lovell, aged 41, had died from her injuries. Her death, after fighting to protect her home and family, caused nationwide outrage. Local residents demanded that the attackers be caught and severely punished. Since arriving in Australia from the United Kingdom, the Lovells had been seen as decent, friendly people with no known enemies. No one could believe such a tragedy had happened to them. Lee was soon discharged from the hospital, but the emotional trauma took far longer to heal. For months, he struggled with his grief and raised his daughters alone. All three suffered from nightmares and anxiety. The girls often slept in his room, which gave them all some comfort. Despite the precautions, Lee later said in an interview that he considered returning to the UK with his children. However, he first wanted justice for Emma and to see the criminal case resolved. The suspects were caught within hours of the attack. Police tracked down and arrested 2 teenagers who had run away from the Lovell home. What shocked everyone was that both were only 17 years old. In particular, Scarlett, Emma's daughter, was extremely shocked to learn that people her age could commit such terrible crimes. When told that Emma had died, the killer reportedly smirked. Because both attackers were minors, their names were withheld under Australian law. This decision angered the public, many of whom felt that the law protected criminals more than victims. An autopsy revealed that Emma suffered several stab wounds to the chest, the final one piercing her heart. She bled out before the paramedics could save her. Her heartbeat faded and returned several times, but she died minutes later without regaining consciousness. When arrested, the killer still had the knife, a weapon with an 11.5 centimeters blade, long enough to kill an adult. As details of the home invasion became public, people were horrified by the brutality of the attack. The public was most shocked by the fact that the attackers were minors. This was particularly troubling because crimes committed by juveniles have been increasing across Australia in recent years. Such incidents occur frequently and are often linked to lenient juvenile justice laws. According to many experts and officials, lenient treatment makes criminals no longer afraid of the law. The Lovell family's home surveillance cameras provided crucial evidence for the police. What Lee and his daughters witnessed was also reported in detail to the investigating agency, helping the police to accurately recreate the crime scene. The group of young men sneaked into the house by breaking down the front door, trying to act quietly. However, the family dog discovered and barked, waking Emma. Although the dog was scared and did not attack, that action inadvertently caused the tragedy to happen. Both suspects confessed that they had gone to the house intending to steal valuables, believing no one was home. They asserted that their goal had been burglary, not murder. Police confirmed this after finding stolen items in their possession. Further investigation revealed that the young man who fatally stabbed Emma had already committed 84 crimes by age 17. Most were burglaries and trespassing. Though some involved violence, none as brutal as this killing. His co-defendant also had numerous, albeit lesser, convictions. Despite their numerous offenses, neither had ever served time in prison, largely because they were considered minors. Each time they were caught, they were released. Even when the killer reported Emma's death, he showed no remorse, smiling as if proud of what he had done. Police said he had also declared that he would not be given a harsh sentence because he was still under 18. Lee was relieved by their quick capture but appalled by Australia's leniency toward offenders under 18. When he realized the law would protect the teens who had murdered his wife, Lee began speaking publicly about the case, stressing that these were not young boys of 13 or 15. The attacker who stabbed Emma would have turned 18 just 4 months later. At that age, he clearly understood the gravity of his actions. Had he been 18, he could have faced a life sentence. Instead, as a 17-year-old, he risked only a short prison term. Meanwhile, human rights activists campaigned for leniency toward both offenders. The murderer claimed he never intended to harm anyone, only to steal, and believed the house was empty. Carrying a knife was meant to be precautionary, not for violence. Police records showed he had a long history of theft, fraud, and breaking into homes. When caught, he often resisted arrest. His criminal behavior began early, shaped by a difficult childhood. Both young men came from impoverished, dysfunctional families in which their parents abused, banned substances and alcohol. Their parents neglected and mistreated them, and both boys often ran away, only to be returned by police. The murderer's home life was especially violent. Neighbors witnessed the abuse and reported it to child services. Authorities intervened quickly, revoked the parents' custody rights, and placed the boy in an orphanage since no relatives could care for him. Tragically, life there was no better. He later reported being frequently beaten by staff and peers. Neighbors and acquaintances of both criminals were extensively interviewed. Many described them as aggressive young men who had clashed with the law from an early age. It was no surprise that they had already turned to serious crime while still minors. The prosecutor wanted the case to be tried in adult court because of the severity of the crime and the offender's near adult age. Lee's lawyers have sought legal remedies to do this. The prosecutor's office also believed the criminals deserved the harshest punishment possible and should spend their lives in prison. However, during the preliminary hearing, it was decided that both defendants would be tried as juveniles. This ensured they would receive lighter sentences. After being charged with multiple crimes, including first-degree murder, attempted murder, and attempted murder, the two criminals began to show less arrogance. The main criminal apologized to Emma's husband, Lee, but the apology was rejected. Lee believes the apology was insincere and was intended only as a plea for leniency, possibly on the advice of his defense attorney. Later, the list of charges against the accomplice was reduced after his lawyer convinced investigators that he had not known his friend was carrying a knife. The accomplice claimed he hadn't brought any weapons because he never intended to fight anyone. He said he thought they were going to rob a house that was supposed to be empty and then run away. His friend had told him which house would be empty on Boxing Day. The accomplice was shocked to find Lee, Emma, and then their youngest daughter in the house. When Lee came toward them to chase them away, everything escalated quickly. The accomplice wanted to run but hesitated when his friend started fighting. Because of this, he argued that he deserved an even lighter sentence. Both young men eventually cooperated with investigators and confessed, which led to a shorter hearing. This was a small relief for Lee and his daughters, since it spared them from having to recount the traumatic events or hear the painful details of Emma's death in court. However, the lenient sentence given to the perpetrator did nothing to ease their pain. Despite efforts by prosecutors and lawyers to have the case tried as an adult, the court upheld its decision to handle it under juvenile law. The two defendants did not recant, possibly on the advice of their lawyers. As cooperation is considered a mitigating factor, there was no point in denying guilt because video footage clearly showed both perpetrators. Their faces were visible, revealing their arrogance and lack of fear of the law. The defense lawyers asked for leniency, citing the difficult upbringings of their clients. The judge considered this but stated it did not excuse their actions. It was also important to establish that the accomplice did not know his friend had a knife or planned to kill anyone. In May 2024, the judge sentenced the 19-year-old who killed Emma to a maximum sentence of 14 years in prison. Legally, he had to serve at least 70% of the sentence, about 10 years, before being eligible for release. The judge called the crime particularly heinous. The defense disagreed, arguing that the sentence was too harsh, and immediately appealed. The appellate court accepted the appeal. The new judge ruled that while the 14-year sentence would stand, the minimum time to be served would be reduced from 70% to 60%. By the time the appeal was resolved, the killer had already served some time. After accounting for 500 days spent in pretrial detention, his total prison time was reduced to just over 6 years. This outcome was another devastating blow for the Lovell family, as the killer's sentence was effectively shortened by nearly a year and a half. As a result, Emma's killer can now be released after serving 8 to 12 years, with his expected release date set for 2031. After learning of the appeals court's decision, the Attorney General announced an appeal to the Supreme Court. Although the outcome remains uncertain, Lee and his supporters expressed deep disappointment and trauma following the court's decision. He said the ruling had caused his family even more pain and condemned the law for favoring criminals while ignoring the fact that he had lost his wife and 2 daughters no longer had their mother. After the hearing, Lee also announced he would campaign for reforms to Australian laws. Many citizens supported Lee's determination. They believed Emma Lovell's murder exposed serious flaws in the current legal system, which they saw as failing to protect ordinary people. The judge explained his ruling by citing the killer's guilty plea, apparent remorse, and potential for rehabilitation. considering his age and behavior. These statements caused outrage in the community, almost as much as the sentence itself. The only aspect that remained unchanged was the supervision the killer would receive after release, leaving many to question whether it would be enough to protect the public. Even Queensland's Attorney General criticized the outcome. He argued that the weak laws were the result of long-standing policies under Labor governments. Observers of the trial were convinced the killer showed no real remorse and had only said what was necessary to receive a lighter sentence, a strategy that, unfortunately, succeeded. The killer's accomplice was tried later that October. This trial was heard by judges alone. The juvenile offender was acquitted of murder and assault because he was not directly involved in Emma Lovell's death. But he was convicted of burglary and breaking and entering the Lovell home. In December, he was sentenced to 18 months in prison. However, since he had already spent more time in custody awaiting trial, he was released immediately. This decision alarmed the local community, as he was known to be a repeat offender. Months before the attack on the Lovells, he had broken into another occupied home. Although the residents scared him off before he could steal anything, he stole a car from the driveway. Ironically, he was later caught when he tried to refuel the stolen car and left without paying. It appeared the offender was incorrigible and likely to re-offend. Because of the lenient laws, the prosecution had to push hard for stronger measures. The prosecutor sought a 12-month suspended sentence after his release, arguing it was the only way to protect both the public and the offender by helping him reintegrate safely. He also pointed out that the young man already had over 100 offenses on record by the time of the murder. The defense lawyers for both the killer and his accomplice focused on mitigating their client's culpability. They highlighted the offender's troubled childhoods, expressions of regret, and desire to change. They claimed their clients planned to participate in rehabilitation programs, find legitimate work in construction, or serve in the military after release. The defense also drew attention to the poor conditions in correctional facilities. Due to staffing shortages, the juvenile offender had been kept in solitary confinement for 110 days. The Lovell family saw this claim of mistreatment as a further insult to Emma's memory. At his sentencing, Lee described in detail the trauma he and his 2 children suffered after the death of his beloved wife. He explained that since the murder, he had been unable to sleep and had done everything possible to support his daughters, though he knew their lives would never return to normal. Lee said that while he had once planned to move to Australia to pursue his dreams, he had recently thought about returning to the UK. However, he decided to stay because his wife was buried in Australia. Lee visits her grave often, sometimes with his daughters, to talk to her and share updates about their lives. Although neighbors, family, and friends offer their support, he admitted that nothing could ease his pain, which he believed would remain with him forever. After the trial, Lee told reporters he felt that UK laws were too lenient, but that Australia's were even worse. He believed the legal system often favored offenders, leaving him feeling unsafe. In response, Lee said he refused to accept such injustice. He began leading efforts to reform Queensland's criminal laws, pushing for mandatory life sentences for murder, with a minimum of 20 years before parole eligibility. His proposal also included applying this rule to juvenile offenders, regardless of age. One peaceful afternoon in Florida, a 13-year-old girl walked into her home to find her 4 younger siblings screaming, crawling around in red stains on the floor. Small, bloody footprints all over the kitchen. There was no sign of forced entry, no goodbyes, just 5 children, left alone beside their mother's body, and the killer who had vanished as if he had never existed. To understand why a mother became the target of such a vicious plan, we must go back many years to where the tragedy really began. Sheila Lee Walsh, born in Topeka, Kansas on October 19, 1962, met her first husband, Alan Blackthorne, shortly after finishing high school. Sheila was small, kind, and quiet. She had a difficult childhood. Her father, an Air Force pilot, was often away, and he died in Laos when she was only 10 years old. She longed for stability, for love, and for a family she could build with her own hands. After college, Sheila found work as an office administrator at a local law firm. That was where she met the charming, confident Alan, a man who quickly swept the inexperienced young woman off her feet. On their third date, he proposed. Within 3 months, they married. Born in June 1955, Alan was 7 years older and, at least on the surface, far more worldly, but Alan's past held shadows Sheila never saw. Long before adulthood, he showed concerning behavior: cruelty toward animals, obsessive attitudes toward girls, even an accusation of attempted abuse while in high school. He had several minor criminal charges, but thanks to a string of lenient judges and expunged records, the man standing before Sheila looked clean, respectable, harmless. Alan easily gained the trust of Sheila's family. Even after the wedding, none of them suspected what was coming. Soon, he convinced them to invest a large sum into his electronics business, claiming he was preparing to expand. They had no idea the business was already failing. By the time the truth surfaced, Alan had declared bankruptcy and whisked his young, pregnant wife off to Hawaii, far from home, dependent and expecting a baby. Sheila found herself cornered, torn between her loyalty to her parents and the father of her unborn child. She still hasn't realized the cruelty of the man she has been with all her life. Years later, much would be revealed. Alan had been married before. His first wife, Eileen, endured extreme physical and psychological abuse, choking, beatings, even being kicked in the stomach while pregnant. Immediately after childbirth, Alan insisted they give the baby up for adoption because he wasn't ready to be a father. His violence extended beyond people. When their dog had an accident on the carpet, Alan beat the animal to death. Not only that, at one point, he forced situations where Eileen's younger brothers would witness intimate moments, and he often pressured her into degrading scenarios for his satisfaction. He also had a habit of dressing in women's lingerie before asking to be driven to rough neighborhoods, where he would wander home alone, a dangerous thrill he craved. Eileen and her husband had a bad marriage that lasted 5 years. During that time, she became pregnant again. Frightened, she decided to have an abortion and secretly began making plans to leave him. His second wife, Mary, initially believed she had met a loving, attentive father figure, but the facade shattered quickly. Alan used her 2 young children to manipulate and control her, threatening violence if she ever tried to leave. After 3 years of escalating intimidation, she fled with her children in the middle of the night, fortunate to escape the prolonged torment Eileen endured. Then came Sheila. When Alan met her, he saw vulnerability and opportunity. They married in 1982. Until that moment, Sheila had no way of knowing about his abusive past or hidden obsessions. At first, he was everything she thought she needed: loving, attentive, protective. But the mask slipped. Slowly, affection turned into criticism, criticism into anger, and anger into daily emotional warfare. Sheila was young, inexperienced, conditioned to believe that any outburst from the man she loved must somehow be her fault. And Alan, skilled in manipulation, took full advantage of that. The turning point came 6 months into the marriage, when Alan, with Sheila in the passenger seat, was involved in a collision with a motorcyclist. The rider died at the scene, and Alan immediately fled, terrified that witnesses had seen him. He phoned his father, who urged him to file a false report claiming he had been attacked by an aggressive stranger and had driven off only to protect his pregnant wife. Allen was eventually charged with fleeing the scene of a fatal accident and failing to render aid. But the case ended in a hung jury, and the district attorney declined to retry him. In the end, Allen walked away without consequences. Despite being responsible for the man's death, after the couple relocated, Allen resumed his attempts to revive his business ambitions. During that time, Sheila's sister visited and was alarmed by her appearance. Sheila was pregnant, but she looked shockingly frail, like the starving children often shown in charity campaigns of the 1,980 seconds. Sheila later admitted to her parents how grim things had become. Yet, despite everything, she had no intention of leaving her husband. Financial dependence kept her trapped. Allen was launching a new business selling electrical muscle stimulators. To secure support, he persuaded relatives to move with them to Honolulu. But in July 1985, the enterprise collapsed. Allen continued advertising the devices, but authorities arrested him and seized his inventory because he lacked the required permits and the machines failed certification. The incident erupted into a public scandal. After the business failed, Allen took Sheila back to California. There, Sheila confided more openly in her sister about what life in Honolulu had been like. Allen frequently insulted her, accused her of affairs, flaunted his own infidelities. He would bring other women into their home and have loud, intimate encounters within earshot of his wife and daughters. Sheila endured it all because she felt financially paralyzed. She had no savings, no support system, and had been isolated from her family. Back in the mainland United States, Allen again managed to attract investors for another business venture, once more involving muscle stimulation devices, this time medically approved. It was during this period that his cruelty escalated. Sheila's sister noticed that Sheila looked older, exhausted, and physically unwell. But alongside this decline came a flicker of resolve. For the first time, Sheila expressed a desire to leave him. A notion sparked after Allen tried to drown her by forcing her head into a toilet and flushing repeatedly. In September 1987, another attack occurred. Allen beat her with a belt before bed, then struck her repeatedly with his fists. Finally, Sheila called the police. Police arrested Allen, but the consequences were minimal, a fine rather than jail time. Sheila seized the chance to flee. She gathered her daughters and ran to the home of Janda, the family's former nanny. Unfortunately, Allen anticipated her escape and intercepted her there. While Janda hurried the children inside, Allen began beating Sheila. A neighbor witnessed the assault and rushed over, managing to drive Allen off. Furious, Allen climbed into Sheila's car, ran over the neighbor, smashed through a gate, then escaped in his own vehicle. He was arrested a few hours later. Miraculously, the neighbor survived with minor injuries. Allen received a $425 fine and 18 months of probation. Following Allen's arrest, Sheila fled with her daughters to Oregon to stay with her sister Carrie. She hid there for several weeks before realizing she could not live indefinitely in secrecy. She needed to face the legal process if she hoped to protect her children permanently. In October 1987, she wrote a detailed, 100-page account documenting years of Allen's abuse. By September 1988, the divorce was finalized in Sheila's favor. She received custody of their daughters, a vehicle, and $1,250 a month in child support. Later, Allen persuaded her to move to San Antonio, promising to buy her a home so she could live closer to the girls. Sheila eventually agreed, a decision she soon realized was a devastating mistake. Once she moved, Allen immediately began manipulating the children against their mother, and child support payments were routinely delayed. Sheila knew Allen had the financial means to pay. He simply chose not to. She had to take him to court for nearly every payment. Allen, obsessed with retaliation, studied family law constantly. searching for loopholes to use against her. He eventually succeeded in reducing the child support amount to $350 in a hearing Sheila hadn't even been notified of. That reduction forced her into further litigation. After additional hearings, the original support amount was reinstated, but each payment remained a battle, a deliberate torment Alan never stopped inflicting. Frustrated and desperate to receive compensation for the years of abuse she had endured, Sheila went back to court demanding her share of Alan's assets. But Alan was exceptionally skilled at hiding his money. Instead of the roughly $250,000 she was entitled to, Sheila received only about $22,000. Despite everything she had suffered, Sheila was determined to rebuild her life and create stability for her children. In August 1992, she met a gentle, soft-spoken man named Jamie Belush. Their relationship blossomed quickly. The two were married in June 1993. Jamie was a devout Christian, a former Marine, and an employee at a pharmaceutical company. Life finally seemed to be turning in Sheila's favor, but Alan was far from finished. He continued to look for new ways to torment his ex-wife. The day before Sheila and Jamie's wedding rehearsal dinner, Alan picked up the girls for a routine visit. Instead of returning them, he sent a bailiff to serve Sheila with yet another lawsuit, this time demanding expanded custody. Sheila and Jamie married the next day, but their honeymoon was overshadowed by the legal hearing that followed. As the girls grew older, around 8 or 9, Sheila began hearing troubling things from them. Her daughter, Stevie, eventually confided that Alan had touched her inappropriately. Sheila used this revelation as leverage. When Alan attempted to file another custody-related lawsuit, she informed him she was prepared to report him for molesting their daughter. Stevie's statement was formally recorded, but Sheila refused to make her daughter face the trauma again in court. The threat alone was enough. Alan backed down. From then on, all communication between them went strictly through attorneys. The children no longer wished to visit Alan, and meanwhile, Sheila began building a new life with Jamie. He wanted children of his own, but Sheila struggled to conceive. They turned to IVF, and in December 1995, Sheila gave birth to quadruplets, 3 boys and 1 girl. For a moment, the chaos of the past seemed finally behind her, yet danger continued to haunt her. When Sheila was 7 months pregnant, her sister Carrie came to visit. Just days earlier, the O.J. Simpson verdict had been announced. Hearing that Simpson had been acquitted of murdering his ex-wife terrified Sheila. She told Carrie she feared that if Simpson could get away with it, then Alan, who had spent years threatening, stalking, and tormenting her, might convince himself he could kill her too. Carrie tried to reassure her, but Sheila remained shaken. She even asked her sister to care for her children if anything ever happened to her, and to contact a woman named Enrule to share what she feared. By June 1997, Alan had filed yet another lawsuit, angry that Stevie had stopped visiting him. Sheila was prepared. She warned him plainly that if he pursued the case, she would report his inappropriate behavior toward their daughter. Realizing she was serious, Alan abruptly withdrew the lawsuit. Shortly afterward, he announced he wanted to terminate his parental rights altogether. Even so, he continued to stalk Sheila from a distance, and she believed he never stopped plotting revenge. Alan manipulated a neighbor into spying on her, convincing the woman that Sheila's children were being mistreated. The neighbor even installed enormous floodlights that shone directly into the Belush family's bedroom every night. Sheila and Jamie complained repeatedly, but law enforcement did nothing. Eventually, the constant harassment drove them to make plans to move. One afternoon, while the nanny was watching the children, Sheila and Jamie returned home to discover that Daryl, Sheila's daughter from her first marriage, had visited her father. Despite losing all parental rights, Alan had still managed to see her. Sheila panicked, terrified he would discover where they were planning to relocate. In a moment of anger and fear, Sheila struck Daryl once with a belt. With Alan's encouragement, Daryl filed a domestic violence complaint, and because Alan no longer had legal rights to her, Daryl was immediately placed into protective custody while an investigation began. The court eventually found no evidence that Sheila or Jamie had abused or coerced their children. The family then quietly moved to Sarasota, Florida at night. But even there, peace was short-lived. A neighbor from Texas eventually revealed their new address to Alan. Daryl, still in state custody during the ongoing proceedings, remained a constant source of anxiety for Sheila and Jamie, who feared she might unintentionally disclose their location. The Bellishes were so cautious that even their closest friends back in San Antonio were told nothing more than a post office box number. During this period, Sheila's anxiety reached its peak. Even though she had been divorced from Alan for nearly 10 years, the fear that he might someday kill her never left her. And tragically, her fear wasn't irrational. Behind the scenes, Alan Blackthorne was actively trying to track her down. He first hired a private investigator to locate her. When that didn't work, he pressured the man into surveilling every Baptist church in the region, hoping to spot Sheila among the congregations. The task was unrealistic. There were simply too many churches, and the investigator eventually abandoned the effort. Alan then returned to the one vulnerable link he still had access to: Daryl, his daughter, who was in the custody of Child Protective Services due to ongoing court proceedings. Daryl was emotionally fragile and deeply conflicted, yet for months she managed not to reveal the Bellish family's new address, partly because she genuinely did not know it herself. But over time, Alan coaxed bits and pieces from her, small clues that slowly painted a picture, and once he had extracted the information he needed, he abruptly cut contact with her, ignoring her calls completely. Next, Alan used a ruse. He hired a man to deliver flowers to the general area Daryl had described. The delivery man went door to door at several houses, asking for Sheila. At one home, Jamie Bellush opened the door and casually accepted the bouquet, unknowingly confirming the correct address. The deliver flowers called Alan back with the details, unaware he had just become part of something far darker than a flower delivery. 13-year-old Stevie Bellish had never had a peaceful life, but everything reached its breaking point on the afternoon of November 7, 1997. She came home from school excited, ready to tell her mother she had been invited on her very first date. But the moment she reached the front steps, something felt wrong. The door was unlocked. Something Sheila never allowed. Inside, Stevie found her 4 younger siblings behaving strangely, screaming in a way she had never heard before. The children, all toddlers, were naked except for life jackets. It looked as if Sheila had been preparing to bathe them in the pool, a normal routine. But something had interrupted her. Stevie walked through the house calling for her mother, but heard nothing. She noticed what looked like red paint streaking her siblings' skin. But at 13, she still didn't fully grasp what she was seeing. Then she entered the living room and saw belongings scattered everywhere, signs of a violent struggle. In the kitchen, she saw clothes on the floor soaked in red. When she lifted them, her world broke open. Her mother, Sheila, lay beneath the pile. Stevie dialed 911, her voice shaking, and told the dispatcher that her 35-year-old mother was dead and that her throat had been cut. The dispatcher stayed on the line until the first officer arrived. The officer walked Stevie outside, where all 4 toddlers clung to her legs, covered in blood. When asked who could have done this, she answered instantly. She knew only one person who had ever wanted her mother dead: her biological father, Alan Blackthorne. Police soon learned that Sheila owned 20% of Alan's profitable medical equipment business, and that Alan owed her $7 million in court-ordered payments, money he had no intention of giving her. The financial motive was overwhelming, but investigators hit their first roadblock. Alan had an ironclad alibi. At the time of the murder, he was at a golf course in Texas. The medical examiner determined that Sheila had been dead for about 2 hours when Stevie found her. The killer first shot her in the face with a .45 caliber handgun. Little Tim, one of the quadruplets, was believed to have been clinging to her when she was attacked. The bullet entered her cheek, exited the back of her head, and sent her crashing to her knees so hard that bruises formed instantly. But she didn't die right away. Sheila somehow stood back up and staggered toward the wall phone. In the kitchen, bleeding heavily, she managed to dial 911, but never spoke, because the killer grabbed a butcher knife from its stand and slashed her throat repeatedly. Even then, Sheila fought. She had multiple defensive wounds, including one deep enough to expose the bone in her arm. The major veins on both sides of her neck were severed. Despite the severity of the wounds, the medical examiner concluded she could have survived if help had reached her in time. Instead, she collapsed on the kitchen floor while her 4 toddlers crawled through her blood, crying and screaming for a mother who could no longer respond. A single fingerprint was found in the dried blood, but it didn't match Alan's or anyone in the household. A broken, blood-stained knife lay next to her body. The crime was brutal. The scene was chaotic, and the killer had vanished. While questioning neighbors, police located the owner of a landscaping company mowing a yard near the Belush home. The landscaper told officers he had seen a white car he didn't recognize pull up to the house earlier that morning. Inside sat a large, intimidating-looking man. Frightened, the landscaper tried not to stare, but he memorized the license plate. When officers ran the tag, it traced back to a woman in Texas, the grandmother of 21-year-old Jose Del Toro. When detectives questioned Alan Blackthorne, he behaved coolly, even giving interviews to the media. He insisted he had only hit Sheila once in their marriage and called it the worst mistake of his life. As expected, he denied killing her and attempted to blame Daniel Alex Rocha, a friend who owned the golf course he frequented. However, his story quickly unraveled. When police reached Daniel, he revealed something far more disturbing. Alan had hired 27-year-old Samuel Gonzalez, first paying him $9,000. Soon after, Gonzalez brought in his 21-year-old cousin, Jose Del Toro, because Alan didn't want to get his own hands dirty. Jose, once a popular high school football star and prom queen's boyfriend, had long since fallen from grace. By 21, he was deep into banned substances and desperate for money. He had a few minor legal problems in the past, but he wasn't known to be violent. That changed when Blackthorne paid him to kill a woman, claiming she was abusing her children. Alan provided Jose with an old photograph of Sheila holding their daughter, taken during their marriage. Investigators later found this photo among Jose's belongings, but Blackthorne made a critical mistake. He hired a pair of unusually incompetent hitmen. Jose used his real identification to check into a motel near the Belush home. Surveillance footage captured him buying camouflage clothing. During interrogation, he crumbled quickly. Jose admitted sneaking into the garage and watching Sheila with her children, noting she seemed like a loving mother. Completely unlike the monster Alan had described, he claimed he almost backed out. But Alan pressured him relentlessly, insisting Sheila was dangerous, had to be dealt with. Even so, parts of Jose's story conflicted with evidence, making investigators doubt his version of events. Samuel Gonzalez, who introduced Alan to his cousin, Jose Luis Del Toro, pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder in June 1998 and was sentenced to 19 years in prison. Daniel Alex Rocha, 29, acted as the middleman connecting Alan with Samuel Gonzalez, was convicted in January 1999 of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole in February 1999. By the time authorities finally located Jose Del Toro, he had already fled to Mexico. With financial help from Rocha, he fought extradition for more than a year. Jose Del Toro was extradited to the United States in July 1999, pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and armed burglary in 2000 in Florida. Judge Paul Logan sentenced Jose to 2 consecutive life terms, the maximum sentence for both charges. At sentencing, he cried and asked Jamie Bellish for forgiveness, vowing to expose everyone involved in Sheila's murder. There's one more important step left, and that's taking down the man who masterminded the entire affair, Alan Blackthorne. With relentless support from Sheila's sister and a team of attorneys, investigators spent 2 full years building the case. Witness after witness came forward describing Alan's long history of abuse toward Sheila and his previous wives. Searches uncovered alarming evidence. Alan and his new wife, Maureen, had been planning Sheila's murder for months. In their garage, investigators found a wall covered with photographs, notes, and a step-by-step plan. Shockingly, the couple seemed so confident in their impunity that they never bothered to remove any of it. During the investigation, Alan transferred nearly $50 million in assets into Maureen's accounts. Jamie Bellish filed 2 civil suits against them, totaling $38 million, and pursued legal action against others involved in the conspiracy. On January 4, 2000, 44-year-old Alan Blackthorne was charged with conspiracy to commit murder and several related offenses. Because he was considered a flight risk, bail was denied. At trial, his daughters Stevie and Daryl testified against him. Alan never once looked at them, showing no emotion, no acknowledgement, nothing. Prosecutors presented nearly 40 pieces of evidence proving a calculated plot to kill Sheila. After closing arguments, the jury deliberated only a few hours before returning a unanimous verdict. Guilty on all counts, Alan Blackthorne was convicted of federal charges of conspiracy to commit interstate murder and interstate domestic violence. He received 2 concurrent life sentences without parole. Beginning at the Beaumont, Texas, federal prison, following his conviction, Alan Blackthorne was transferred to federal prison, where he quickly became a target. Inmates attacked him several times, once stabbing him repeatedly, and in another assault, driving a sharpened screwdriver into his eye. Despite the brutality of these attacks, Alan survived. On November 18, 2014, at the age of 59, he died in federal custody in Terre Haute, Indiana. The official cause of death was never released, even within his own family. Reactions were cold and distant. His wife, Maureen Blackthorne, who had been convicted on financial charges in 2004, filed for divorce the following year. Meanwhile, Jamie Bellish took custody of the quadruplets as well as Stevie, Sheila's daughter from her first marriage, but forgiveness did not come easily. Jamie struggled deeply with resentment toward Daryl, who had once confronted Sheila with allegations of abuse and unwittingly revealed clues about the family's location, information Alan Blackthorne later exploited. Although Daryl had been manipulated as a child and never intended harm, Jamie found it difficult to separate her innocence from the catastrophic consequences that followed. In 2001, after years of legal battles, Alan's remaining assets, roughly $5 million, were finally unfrozen and distributed among Sheila's children. It offered financial security but could never replace what they had lost. In the months before her death, Sheila had confided in her sister, asking her to contact writer Anne Rule if the worst ever happened. Honoring that request, her sister reached out. Rule later included Sheila's case in her work, ensuring that her story and the brutality she endured would never be forgotten. The peaceful town of Northfield was almost crime-free, but on the fateful morning of August 3, 2022, that peace was shattered. Cassandra Sweeney, a devoted young mother, at home with her 2 young sons, had been chatting happily with her husband via text message just hours before. Everything was normal, until the text messages suddenly stopped. And in that quiet moment, a tragedy unfolded. Receiving a panicked call from his younger brother, Sean Sweeney rushed home, not knowing that in just a few minutes, his life would be completely destroyed. When the police arrived, the door was broken open, and through the glass was a horrifying image never seen before in Northfield. A mother and two young children lying motionless in a pool of cold blood. Who committed this crime? A stranger broke in as they claimed a revenge, or is the killer actually someone familiar, living in the same house? As the police follow the first clues, the missing gun, the fingerprints, and the unusual calm demeanor of a teenager, the curtain of truth gradually rises, covering the entire town in obsession. 3 lives gone, a family torn apart, and the killer. Is it someone no one expected? Northfield, New Hampshire, USA, is a small, picturesque town with fewer than 5,000 residents. Located south of the White Mountains, it's known as one of the safest places in the area, with very low crime rates. Violent incidents were almost non-existent, especially compared to the current social situation. It was precisely because of that peace that many families chose Northfield as a place to settle down and raise their children. That was also the reason Cassandra Sweeney decided to make this place her home. Cassandra was born and raised near Northfield and always dreamed of a peaceful life, surrounded by love. After finishing high school, she went to college, where she met her future husband, Sean Sweeney. The two shared the same views on traditional families, so they quickly got along and built a common future plan. Their relationship grew stronger and eventually led to marriage. In 2018, they celebrated the birth of their first son, Benjamin. That same year, Sean suffered a devastating loss when his mother passed away. Despite his grief, he had to stay strong for his family. He was especially concerned about his younger brother, Eric, who was born in 2006. With their mother gone and no one else to care for him, Eric risked being placed in foster care. Sean stepped in and became his legal guardian, bringing him to live with his family. In the fall of 2020, Cassandra and Sean welcomed their second son, Mason. Cassandra is extremely happy and hopes that one day she will have a baby girl so that her family will feel even more complete. She worked night shifts as a nurse's assistant while Sean worked full-time, both striving to create the life they had always envisioned. On August 3, 2022, 25-year-old Cassandra was at home in Northfield with 4-year-old Benjamin and nearly 2-year-old Mason. Sean went to work, hoping for a promotion. Good news for the whole family. Cassandra planned to quit her job early to take care of her child full-time. Sean's younger brother, Eric, then 16, still lived with them in the basement of the house. The Sweeneys seemed to be living in perfect happiness. That morning began like any other. Cassandra texted Sean several pictures of the kids playing with their dogs, keeping up a cheerful conversation. Then, abruptly, the messages stopped. Sean assumed she was busy with chores and didn't think much of it. Sometime after 11 o'clock a.m., Sean received a frantic call from Eric. He claimed that burglars had broken into the house and that he was going after them. He also said that Cassandra and the children had been hurt, but offered no details. Sean immediately called 911 at 11:21 a.m. He told the dispatcher that his younger brother, who lived with them, had just called to report a break-in and possible injuries. Unsure what had happened, Sean asked for officers to respond right away and mentioned that one of their dogs could be aggressive towards strangers. He left work at once and headed home. Police arrived within minutes. When they knocked, no one answered. The officers walked around the house and peered through the windows. One of them spotted an adult woman and a child lying motionless in a pool of blood inside the dining room. They broke down the front door to enter. Sean arrived shortly after. Inside, officers found the bodies of a young woman and a small child. They were later identified as Cassandra and Mason, both killed by gunshot wounds to the head. 4-year-old Benjamin was found just a few steps from Cassandra, lying on the dining room floor. It appeared he had tried to escape the attackers but hadn't made it in time. He had been shot in the head, with the fatal bullet striking just above his right eyebrow. Cassandra's face showed powder burns, leading examiners to conclude that she had been shot from a distance of about half a meter, almost point blank. Mason was shot in the forehead, and the bullet lodged behind the boy's left ear. Aside from gunshot wounds, none of the victims had other injuries. The house was somewhat messy, but investigators believed the disorder was unrelated to the attack and likely caused by the children earlier. None of the victims had any chance to resist or defend themselves. While detectives were combing through the house, Sean's younger brother, 16-year-old Eric, arrived. He parked Cassandra's car in the driveway and calmly approached the officers. Nearby, Sean struggled to contain his emotions, a sharp contrast to Eric's composed demeanor. Eric said he had chased the robbers but couldn't catch them and returned home to help, only to find everyone dead. His story seemed suspicious. The medical examiner ruled all 3 deaths as homicides. Detectives immediately noticed inconsistencies. If this had been a robbery, why were there no signs of forced entry or stolen items, despite Eric's account of a struggle? There was no supporting evidence. Investigators began to suspect that the attack had been intentional rather than random. But what was the motive? Cassandra had no known enemies, no family conflicts, no debts, and no history of banned substance use. The brutality of the murders suggested the killer might have been someone close, someone who deeply resented the family. In that context, Sean became the prime suspect and was thoroughly investigated. During questioning, he appeared distraught but cooperative. He said he and Cassandra had a happy marriage, with no affairs or plans for divorce. Other relatives confirmed Sean's account, except for Eric. The teenager claimed that his brother had long been violent toward his wife. However, investigators found no supporting evidence. When they checked police records, there were no reports of domestic violence involving Sean. Instead, they found troubling information about Eric himself, who was known to have behavioral issues. Friends and relatives confirmed that Sean and Cassandra had expressed concerns about Eric's behavior, but no one witnessed or confirmed the abuse. Sean's alibi was quickly verified. He had been at work during the attack, confirmed by witnesses and security footage, ruling him out as a suspect. With Sean cleared, suspicions began to turn toward Eric. Police then focused on Eric Sweeney, the only family member at home during the murders. When asked to come in for questioning, he appeared nervous but cooperative. At the station, he waived his Miranda rights, though, as a minor, an adult had to be present. The interview took place with his brother Sean by his side. Eric said he had woken up early as usual, taken a shower upstairs, and seen Cassandra and the children going about their morning routine. Since he lived in the basement, he gathered his laundry and went downstairs to start a load. While in the basement, he suddenly heard a loud crash from above, followed by a man's rough voice and several sharp popping sounds, which he believed were gunshots. Terrified, Eric said he stayed hidden in the basement until everything went silent. When the noise finally stopped, Eric went upstairs and found Cassandra, Benjamin, and Mason lying motionless, covered in blood. None of them showed signs of life. The attackers were gone, and Eric couldn't tell whether his family members were still alive. However, when he looked out the window and saw a car outside, he immediately ran out to take Cassandra's car and give chase. When Eric reached the yard, the car had just driven away. While starting the car, he called Sean to tell him the news. Although Eric denied any involvement in the attack, inconsistencies appeared in his story compared to the evidence later found. Sean, still grieving, struggled to believe what he heard. When asked about his relationship with Eric, Sean first grew quiet, then visibly saddened. The police also knew the family kept a dog that was hostile to strangers and would have attacked any intruder. Detectives decided to test Eric's story, asking about the dog's reaction during the attack. Eric claimed the animal had remained silent. This statement raised suspicions. If the dogs hadn't barked, it might mean the killer was someone familiar to them, someone from within the family. But Eric's account contradicted other details of his story. Investigators found several gardeners working near the scene that morning. They were questioned, but no one confirmed Eric's words. The gardeners reported seeing no strangers enter or leave the house. Around 11 o'clock a.m., however, they heard a loud noise, and moments later, a young man who matched Eric's description ran out the front door. Visibly upset, he got into Cassandra's car and drove off alone. These witness statements were supported by surveillance footage from nearby houses. No strange cars appeared. The only one was 16-year-old Eric's car. He appeared nervous and in a rush. No weapon was found at the scene. As a result, suspicion toward Eric intensified. Investigators considered the possibility that he had fled not to chase anyone, but to dispose of the gun. Ballistic tests showed that all the victims had been shot with a .40 caliber pistol. Sean admitted owning a weapon of that type, but he reported it missing. The police obtained a warrant to search Eric's car and planned to test his hands for gunshot residue, believing there might still be traces if he had recently fired a weapon. On August 9, 2022, the forensic results came back. Samples taken from Eric's hands revealed the presence of gunshot residue. Similar traces were found on the steering wheel of the silver Ford F-150 he had been driving. The same residues appeared both on the inner and outer surfaces of his hands, further strengthening the case against him. Still, Eric maintained his innocence, denying any role in the murders. Investigators began focusing on identifying a possible motive. Meanwhile, Eric's relationship with Sean completely broke down. Sean refused to live under the same roof as the person suspected of killing their family. Eric was placed under child protective supervision, and police maintained close contact with him. As long as he remained a suspect, he could not be released to another family. Meanwhile, Sean is actively cooperating with the investigation and believes Eric is guilty. Wanting to understand Eric better, investigators looked into his background and family situation. Cassandra and Sean had been his legal guardians since June 2019. Sean had opposed the idea of Eric living with strangers, believing keeping him in the family was the right thing to do. Although Eric exhibited behavioral problems and occasionally ran away from home, his actions were considered typical teenage rebellion. No one could have imagined he might turn violent. At first, the relationship between the brothers, Cassandra, and the children was harmonious. Eric quickly adjusted to living with them and even helped care for his nephews. However, the loss of his mother deeply affected him, making him more withdrawn and causing some minor mental health struggles. When Eric was 15, neighbors complained to Sean about Eric's behavior. One woman alleged that she saw Eric kill a cat, though this claim could not be proven. Even though Sean knew Eric had lied, he still chose to believe and protect Eric, because he could not believe his younger brother would harm an animal. Over time, Eric's situation worsened. His academic performance declined sharply, but he seemed indifferent. Sean, who was doing well in life, tried to help his younger brother, but Eric resisted all attempts at guidance. The family's relationship slowly fell apart. Eventually, the school considered expelling Eric, marking a turning point in his troubled adolescence. By then, both Cassandra and Sean had lost patience and no longer wanted to support him. Eric refused to continue studying, saying he would find a job instead, but he never did. He continued to live off his brother and sister-in-law without contributing. Every attempt to contact Eric resulted in an argument. In the months leading up to the massacre, tensions between him and Sean had become increasingly severe. Sean confirmed that Eric had become more aggressive and provocative than ever. The growing friction caused constant arguments, exhausting Cassandra emotionally. By the time of the attack, Sean and Eric were barely speaking. Cassandra, weary of the ongoing conflict, began to distance herself as well. The arguments about Eric began to destroy their relationship, leaving them unsure of what to do. In the weeks leading up to the murder, Sean called the police several times to report Eric's behavior because he feared for the safety of his wife and children. He said Eric had lost control and had threatened and attacked Cassandra and his sons. The first police report was filed on June 6, 2022. That day, Sean called police to report his car stolen after realizing it, and some valuables were missing. He soon discovered that Eric had taken the car without permission. Eric often took the car to meet friends, drive around, drink, or use banned substances. When arrested, Eric admitted to stealing the car. The next serious incident occurred on July 22, when Eric made alarming threats during an argument. He said he had hidden a gun in the garage and planned to use it at night while everyone slept. Sean immediately called the police, who searched the garage but found nothing. Since Eric had never physically attacked anyone, officers left without taking further action. The family's fear grew so intense that Sean began locking the master bedroom and children's room at night and considered forcing Eric to leave the house. He repeatedly shared that he regretted taking on the responsibility of Eric's guardianship. The crisis reached its peak on August 2, the day before the shooting at the Sweeney home. That day, Cassandra noticed some cash missing again and confronted Eric when Sean returned from work. Another heated argument followed. According to Sean, he finally lost his temper, as everyone was exhausted by Eric's behavior. Eric once again threatened to shoot, and Sean responded by threatening to throw him out. The family no longer called the police, believing it would make no difference. Investigators later discovered that the master bedroom door had been unlocked on the day of the triple murder. It is unclear whether Eric took advantage of this or if Cassandra had simply forgotten to lock it. Sean had installed the locks out of concern that Eric might try to access his safe, which contained his .40 caliber pistol for self-defense. Usually, Sean kept it secured and asked Cassandra to do the same. But that day, something went wrong. When detectives entered the bedroom on the first day of the investigation, Sean showed them the safe. It had been forced open. Some ammunition remained, but the fully loaded pistol was gone. Additional rounds were also missing. According to Sean, there had been enough ammunition to fill several magazines. The absence of forced entry and the shooter's knowledge of the home and the safe proved it was not a robbery. The killer knew both the victims and the house well. As suspicions about Eric grew stronger and began to be confirmed, it became clear that the missing gun might have been hidden and was accessible only to a troubled teenager ready to use it at any moment. Immediate action was required, so investigators began tracking Eric's cell phone, since he had called Sean while driving. It seemed likely that he hadn't left his phone at home when disposing of the weapon, allowing detectives to trace his movements. 3 days after the investigation began, detectives searched the wooded area near the Sweeney family home. This location was chosen based on the phone's geolocation data, though the signal's low accuracy made the search difficult. After more than a day of searching, they finally succeeded. Police found a .40 caliber pistol along with nearly 20 rounds of ammunition. Ballistic tests confirmed the gun had been used to murder Sean's family. 2 fingerprints were found on the gun and the magazine, which belonged to the gun's owner, Sean, and Eric. Despite the growing evidence, Eric continued to deny any involvement. Based on the evidence, he was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and tampering with physical evidence. He refused to cooperate with investigators, so he was assigned a public defender, who quickly took over the case. The defense focused on Eric's age, arguing that, as a minor, he deserved special consideration. The defense attorney described Eric's difficult childhood, living with an alcoholic mother, often hungry, and being abused by those around him. The defense also tried to shift suspicion onto Sean, suggesting he might have had a motive to kill his own family. But this claim didn't hold up. There were no life insurance policies or conflicts that supported such a theory. Everyone agreed that Eric had been the main source of tension in the family. During a search of the Sweeney home, investigators discovered Eric's diaries. According to the prosecution, these showed that he had been planning the murders as an act of revenge. The precise reason for his anger was unclear, but it seemed tied to his resentment toward his brother and sister-in-law, who had tried to help him improve his behavior and find a job. The diary records many family conflicts, which Sean acknowledged, but he said were only part of an effort to discipline Eric. Eric's rage eventually spiraled out of control. Several teenage acquaintances also confirmed that Eric had repeatedly said he wanted Sean and his family dead. Before the tragedy, Eric had even discussed how to inflict the greatest pain on his brother, saying he would kill his brother's wife and children. However, friends dismissed these as dark jokes, and no one paid any attention. It is worth noting that most of Eric's group of friends had behavioral problems and were often at odds with their families. When the first defense strategy failed, Eric's lawyer tried a new approach, claiming the teen was mentally ill. He even distorted a neighbor's statement about Eric killing a cat to use as supposed proof of his insanity. The psychiatric assessments took time. Independent experts were brought in and quickly concluded that Eric was insane. However, this conclusion contradicted previous findings during trial preparation. Eric had no clear medical history. Eric had never sought medical help before. Eric's lawyer argued that Sean had ignored the warning signs and failed to get his brother timely treatment. But this argument was not convincing. During interrogations, Eric was unusually calm, showing a steadfastness rarely seen in other killers. There were no visible signs suggesting he was mentally ill. Eventually, the focus shifted to strengthening the prosecution's case. They had all the necessary evidence, including the murder weapon covered in Eric's fingerprints. Then, several weeks before the hearing, Eric unexpectedly confessed. This brought Sean a bittersweet sense of relief. Sean was still struggling with the fact that his own younger brother had betrayed him so horrifically. Eric's lawyer supported his decision to confess, hoping it would reduce his sentence and charges. It did. Prosecutors dropped the evidence tampering charge. The defense argued that after killing Cassandra and her 2 sons, Eric had intended to harm himself. He took a gun, drove to a remote area, but panicked and stopped himself. Eric couldn't explain what drove him to commit the murders, insisting that he loved his family. The key question now was how he should be tried. Since he was 16 at the time of the crime, he was still legally a minor, which could drastically affect the outcome. If tried as a juvenile, he might have served only a few years and been released once he reached adulthood. This possibility outraged the public. Many people had already criticized law enforcement for ignoring the family's earlier warnings. Public anger grew when the debate turned to whether his age should lessen his punishment. But the brutal nature of the crimes and his disturbing previous behavior convinced the court he was extremely dangerous. It was decided that he would be tried as an adult. Prosecutors recommended a minimum sentence of 97 years in prison, 35 years to life for the murder of Cassandra, and 40 years to life for each of Benjamin and Mason. After Eric pleaded guilty, the charges were reduced to 3 counts of second-degree murder. The trial was held under a summary procedure, and in October 2025, at the age of 19, Eric Sweeney was sentenced to 60 years in prison. He will be eligible for parole in 2075. When he turns 68, this worries Sean, who is seeking to revoke that parole. Some of Cassandra and Sean's relatives hope Eric will suffer in prison, even die there, or be punished by his fellow inmates. What if a young woman could disappear in one of the world's largest cities without leaving a trace? What if every clue conflicted with the last? Every witness remembered something different, and the people who claimed to help her were the ones putting her in danger. This is the story of Corinna Slusser, a 19-year-old who came to New York City, hoping for a fresh start, only to be pulled into a world of manipulation, false promises, and hidden threats behind friendly faces. In the weeks before she vanished, Corinna shared glamorous photos and optimistic captions online, trying to appear in control while her life unraveled. Strained relationships, risky friendships, and the growing influence of two men who would ultimately shape her fate. On September 20th, 2017, she walked out of a motel in Queens and was never seen again. To understand how she ended up there, alone, vulnerable, and isolated, we must return to the beginning, to the life she was struggling to rebuild before everything fell apart. Corinna Slusser was born on March 6, 1998, in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. After her parents divorced, she was raised by her mother, Sabina Tuordo. Corinna was an outgoing, engaged student who did well academically. In high school, she often took part in cheerleading, kept up with makeup and fashion trends, and maintained an Instagram account to share positive images of herself and her future dreams. Corinna had dreamed of becoming a makeup artist. However, in 2016, signs of trouble began to appear. She changed her friends, started skipping school, and was influenced by a new group. That same year, she was arrested for petty theft, which marked a turning point in her behavior. She grew irritable, distanced herself from her family, and often came home with expensive things she couldn't afford, worrying her mother. By spring 2017, Corinna was in emotional and mental distress. In April, she attempted self-harm and was hospitalized. After being discharged, she moved to Hazleton to live with a friend and start over. She got a job as a waitress at a cheap restaurant, probably an Applebee's or something similar. At first, life was relatively stable. She had a job, a small income, but was independent. But soon, she began spending more than she earned and sought easy money. Messages later showed that she started seeing men who gave her gifts, cash, and helped with her living expenses. At first, she described this as being a sugar baby, but it quickly became an unhealthy dependency. As her financial problems grew, tensions rose between her and her friend, and eventually, she had nowhere to stay. Her relationship with her mother also completely broke down. Her mother, Sabina, warned her of the danger she was in, but she reacted with anger. On Instagram, Corinna consistently posted glamorous, filtered photos with confident captions, saying she was strong and about to move into her first apartment. Despite the fact that she was living in unstable, temporary housing, her posts then transitioned to photos taken in random apartments and rundown motels, showing her life in increasing chaos. By summer 2017, Corinna's situation had worsened. Financial stress, conflicts with her mother, and dependence on online relationships made her vulnerable to exploitation. What had once felt like freedom turned into a series of bad decisions. During this time, she met a 32-year-old man named Giovanni Peguero, who promised her a new beginning in New York City. On August 19, 2017, Corinna arrived in New York and was picked up by Giovanni. He seemed confident and caring, and told her he would help her find an apartment and a steady job. He took her to the Harlem Vista Hotel, paid for a few nights, and said it was just a temporary place to stay until they found an apartment and a job. Corinna trusted him, since she was in a strange city and didn't know anyone. At first, everything seemed fine. Giovanni brought her meals, took her shopping, and stayed close to her. He slowly began controlling her, telling her who to speak to, taking her ID and documents to help with apartment paperwork, and monitoring her phone. Gradually, he commented on her photos and scolded her whenever she talked to other men. Corinna didn't realize she was being manipulated. By August 21, they began arguing. He accused her of disappointing him and demanded she act the right way. He only allowed her to go out with him, isolated her from friends, blocked her contacts, and undermined her relationship with her mother, insisting no one cared about her except him. Corinna was becoming trapped and cut off from the outside world. On August 25, the first known violent incident occurred. Giovanni attacked Corinna in her Harlem Vista hotel room, pushing her onto the bed, choking her and screaming. Corinna said that the reason was because he took $300 from her. Corinna called the police, who documented her injuries and took her statement. Giovanni was arrested and charged with assault and strangulation. After Giovanni's arrest, Corinna was left in complete isolation. She had no papers, no money, and no one to help her. She only had enough money to stay in a hotel for a few days, and then she was forced to leave. Although she told her friends she was managing fine and staying in control, her situation was steadily deteriorating. Without identification, she couldn't find work, rent a place, or access official support. Despite this, Corinna stayed in New York, with no intention of returning home due to her strained relationship with her mother. She began searching online for places to stay, meeting men through apps and social media. Although she continued to post smiling pictures and positive quotes on Instagram, in reality, she had to spend the night at the homes of strangers, men she met online. They offered her temporary shelter or a little help in exchange for her attention. These arrangements were unsafe and unstable, leaving her increasingly vulnerable. Some men shared her personal information, demanded intimate photos, or suggested posting escort ads for her online. By early September 2017, her photos appeared on escort service websites. They were likely posted without her consent, and while no name was listed, her friends easily recognized her. The phone numbers in the ads changed frequently, and some pictures were altered. Even though she wasn't yet controlled by one person, she was already being drawn into exploitation. Around that time, a 21-year-old man, Ishi Woni, contacted her. He knew Giovanni and, as later became clear, operated within the same circles. Ishi offered to help Corinna through her ordeal, promising safe housing and financial support. He presented himself as knowledgeable and trustworthy, and convinced her to move temporarily to the Haven Motel in Queens. But this was the first step in making her completely dependent on him. Within days at the Haven Motel, Ishi began posting ads with her photos. He set the prices, wrote the descriptions, and controlled all communication with clients. Corinna was forced to obey his rules. Their messages show his dominance. He demanded constant updates, obedience, and gratitude. Her movements were restricted, and he tracked her phone. And she gradually lost all freedom. At the motel, there were other girls in similar situations. The tension increased, leading to competition, jealousy, and conflict. Corinna sometimes resisted or tried to act on her own but soon backed down, uncertain where to find help. By then, her identity was tied to multiple online profiles and phone numbers, trapping her deeper in exploitation. Technically, she was free to leave, but without money, ID, or support, escape was nearly impossible. On September 20, 2017, Corinna was last seen leaving the motel. Witnesses and security footage confirmed her departure. From that moment, she vanished. By the time she was declared missing, she had already fallen under someone else's control. What began as an offer of help ended with her losing all autonomy. At first, no one realized she was missing. Given the chaos in her life, her silence didn't seem unusual. Friends assumed she had changed her phone number, and her mother thought she was simply upset. Several days passed before anyone understood that something was truly wrong. In late September, Daphné Huard-Boudreault, Corinna's mother, returned from Florida and found the house unusually quiet. Corinna wasn't answering messages, and all the belongings she'd left before leaving for New York were still untouched. Daphné then contacted the Bloomsburg Police Department. Initially, officers treated it as a voluntary disappearance by an adult. But when Daphné presented a copy of the restraining order against Giovanni, along with letters he had sent after his arrest, the case was transferred to New York authorities. Investigators began examining Corinna's online activity and financial records. One of the first leads took them to the Haven Motel in Queens. The manager confirmed that a young woman matching Corinna's description had stayed there in September with a younger man who paid in cash. She appeared tired and spoke very little. The last sighting of her was on September 20th. After she left, the room remained empty for 2 days until housekeeping arrived. Inside, staff found a few belongings: makeup, a pharmacy receipt, and an empty purse. But her phone, identification, and clothes were gone. Police later discovered that the room was booked under a false name, and the payments were traced to Ishi's debit card. When questioned, Ishi claimed that Corinna had left on her own and denied knowing where she went. He said she had been communicating with someone from the Bronx, but offered no further details. Investigators also found that his phone had been wiped and the SIM card replaced. A digital investigation revealed that, in the week before her disappearance, Corinna had visited escort service websites using her phone. Although her listings had been deleted, cached copies were recovered. They had been posted from IP addresses in the Bronx and Queens, the same areas where Ishi and his associates operated. The ads were created in batches, using similar wording, descriptions, and photos of different women. As the investigation expanded, authorities found links between Corinna and people connected to a man named Giovanni Pagero. One witness confirmed that Corinna had worked with their group for a short time before another guy, who matched Ishi's description, took over. This was the first time police confirmed that Giovanni and Ishi were part of the same network. Though solid proof was still lacking, no one had reported abuse, and Corinna was legally an adult. By November 2017, investigators began to suspect that Corinna might have been taken out of New York. They checked transportation hubs and reviewed surveillance footage but found no sign of her. The last signal from her phone came late at night on September 20th in the Bronx, after which it went silent permanently. The case came to a standstill. Reports repeatedly mentioned 3 names: Corinna, Giovanni, and Ishi. Everything pointed to that final day, but what happened afterward remained uncertain. She could have left voluntarily, met with harm, or been transferred to another network. None of these theories could be confirmed. Corinna's mother, Sabina, refused to give up. As the official investigation slowed, she became determined to keep attention on her daughter's case. She began by posting on Facebook, contacting journalists, and writing to the police. Most of the time, she received only standard replies. The investigation is ongoing. Concerned the case would fade from memory, she started reaching out to online communities focused on missing persons. Corinna's photos began circulating on forums and public groups across New York City. Sabina personally searched listings, sometimes thinking she recognized her daughter in new images. Every lead she found, she passed on to investigators, who always promised to follow up. By November 2017, Sabina realized that it was necessary to attract public attention. She spoke with local TV stations in Pennsylvania and shared details about Giovanni's arrest and Corinna's last known stay at the Haven Motel. That media coverage was the first major breakthrough. The story spread quickly online, and strangers began contacting her about sightings of Corinna on the subway, in Atlantic City, and elsewhere. Sabina passed all the information to the police, which led to dozens of leads, none of which were ever verified. Still, the growing attention ensured that Corinna's case could not be forgotten. Sabina then created a page called Help Find Corinna Slusser to raise awareness and collect funds for a reward. Within a month, thousands of people had joined. Volunteers helped design flyers and share posts online. Sabina traveled to New York herself, posting flyers throughout the Bronx and Queens. On one occasion, she was fined for unauthorized posting. At the same time, a legal battle began to unfold. Sabina hired a lawyer and demanded that her daughter's case be included in a federal anti-trafficking initiative. Her efforts paid off. The case was reclassified from a voluntary disappearance to a high-risk missing person investigation with suspected exploitation. That changed everything. Homeland Security became involved, investigating Ishi's connections, looking for other victims, and tracking similar criminal networks. Corinna's name was added to the Federal Missing Persons Database. In December 2017, the FBI offered a $10,000 reward for any information leading to the case. The story spread nationwide. Under media pressure, Ishi was questioned again. He denied all involvement, claiming Corinna was an adult who had made her own choices. He insisted he hadn't seen her after September 20th and didn't know where she went. Then a breakthrough came. One of Ishi's former acquaintances, a young woman, contacted Sabina's attorney. She described a darker reality: manipulation, threats, rules, and debts that kept the girls trapped. Leaving without permission, she said, was considered betrayal. This was the first circumstantial evidence that Corinna had not voluntarily disappeared. Sabina refused to give up. She visited shelters, spoke with staff at victim support organizations, shared Corinna's photo, and left her contact information. By January 2018, other mothers began reaching out to Sabina. Their daughters had vanished under similar circumstances. Online connections, promises of opportunities, trips to New York, and then silence. Sabina realized her daughter's case wasn't an isolated event. She started collaborating with anti-trafficking groups and speaking publicly. Sabina came to accept several possibilities. Corinna might have been taken, she might have died, or she could be hiding, too afraid to return. But as long as Corinna wasn't found, there was still hope. And Sabina fought to keep that hope alive, for herself and for others. Meanwhile, investigators gathered every piece of evidence they could. They interviewed everyone connected to the case, analyzed online activity, and traced IP addresses linked to Corinna. Still, no major breakthroughs emerged. She had vanished in a city where hundreds go missing. The evidence was weak, the witnesses uncertain, and nothing concrete enough to press charges. Sabina continued her work alone. She kept detailed notes of every call, message, and new lead. This record later became the foundation for a public database that tracked Corinna's disappearance almost hour by hour. Sabina's persistence kept the case alive. While investigators stayed silent, she spoke out. As the city moved on, her voice became the last one, speaking for a daughter the world had almost forgotten. When Corinna Slusser's case was made a federal matter, several agencies stepped in: the FBI, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, and Homeland Security. They believe her disappearance was related to abuse, which allowed them to use more advanced investigative tools, including telecommunications data and restricted databases from classified advertising websites. Agents started by reviewing Corinna's digital trail. They traced phone numbers and IP addresses, uncovering dozens of ads featuring her images. Some had been posted in October and November 2017, after she went missing, suggesting someone continued to use her likeness. The ads didn't mention her name but matched her images exactly, right down to poses, angles, and identifying marks. The phone numbers change frequently, but some have been linked to previous criminal investigations involving escorts. The FBI found that many phone numbers had been disguised through call forwarding services. Further analysis showed that some of these lines were registered under the names of women previously linked to Ishi. This led agents to broaden the list of potential accomplices and revealed that Ishii's operations were well organized and extensive, not just the work of one man. The scheme involved fake advertisements, proxies, and rental properties obtained with forged documents. Search warrants were issued for Ishii's digital devices and those of his associates. The seized smartphones contained key evidence photos of Corinna Slusser, encrypted client chats, and audio messages with direct orders and threats. Investigators also found group conversations about prices, meeting places, and how often encounters occurred. The repeated phrase, "she can't say no," appeared in multiple messages, combined with victim statements. This showed that Corinna had no control over her situation and had been coerced. The FBI interviewed dozens of women who had worked with Ishii. Their testimonies varied. Some were frightened, others had left earlier, and a few still felt afraid of him. Some remembered hearing Corinna's name, while others saw her picture on Ishii's phone. Several admitted that Ishii rotated ad listings among different women depending on availability or client payment, which explained why Corinna's name and photos kept appearing even after her disappearance. Meanwhile, investigators tracked transportation and surveillance data from Queens and the Bronx, placing Ishii near the Haven Motel. Footage from the day Corinna vanished showed him leaving the motel alone, without any belongings. Although Ishii claimed he didn't know what happened to her, his actions told a different story. Motel logs and call records showed he continued to use Corinna's phone number after September 20, directly contradicting his statements and deepening suspicion that he was hiding information. Federal prosecutors began preparing formal charges. The main charge focused on human trafficking under aggravated circumstances, including coercion, threats, and exploitation of a minor. Corinna was 19 when she met Ishii, and investigators believed her trafficking was part of a broader organized network. Authorities also investigated other women's cases linked to Ishii to establish a pattern of exploitation. Building the case, even without a recovered body, the search for Corinna targeted every location associated with Ishii: rented properties, places he visited, and transportation hubs. Multiple raids produced little direct evidence related to Corinna, but in one operation, investigators found belongings of another young woman who later reported she had been abused by Ishii. Her testimony strengthened the prosecution's case and supported a broader indictment. By spring 2018, the investigation entered a new phase. Authorities formed an international task force, suspecting Corinna might have been taken out of the country to Canada or the Dominican Republic. Interpol was contacted, but no biometric data matched. Investigators concluded there were only two likely outcomes. Corinna was either deceased or being held somewhere in the US. Completely isolated, the FBI expanded its list of suspects to at least 6 individuals connected to Ishii and the online ads. None could confirm seeing Corinna after September 20, and none provided concrete leads on her whereabouts. The investigation ran into a common but intractable problem: no body, no direct witnesses, and no clear endpoint. But thanks to the evidence they gathered, dozens of gigabytes of data, testimony from other women, and digital clues, investigators built a solid case. All of it suggested that Corinna's disappearance was not voluntary, but part of a larger criminal operation. Her story became a disturbing reminder of how easily someone can disappear in the digital age, how a young woman can vanish in weeks, unseen, despite a nationwide effort to bring her back into the light. By 2022, the federal investigation into Corinna Slusser's disappearance had concluded. After years of gathering evidence, prosecutors filed charges against Ishii Wani, who was convicted of human trafficking and exploiting multiple women. At least 6 young women were confirmed as victims of his crimes. Although Corinna was not the central focus of the prosecution, her disappearance remained unexplained. Substantial circumstantial evidence suggested Ishii's likely involvement. The U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York sentenced him to 10 years in federal prison without parole and ordered him to pay restitution to several victims. This sentencing was notable. as it represented one of the few cases in which a trafficker received a lengthy prison term despite the absence of a body or direct physical evidence in a major episode of the case. Attention also turned again to Giovanni Peguero. His arrest on August 25, 2017, was the only recorded legal action taken against him. He was never formally charged in connection with Corinna's disappearance. Despite his key role in bringing her to New York, a pivotal moment in her story, he was not named as a suspect in the federal case. Corinna's name surfaced in court not as a witness or defendant, but as a symbol of a young woman lost in the gray area between the internet, the streets, and a justice system that moved too slowly. Her case prompted changes in how law enforcement investigates digital exploitation and the targeting of vulnerable women. Yet, for her mother, no verdict could bring closure. Corinna's body was never found, and her disappearance remains unsolved. It began with a viral dance, nothing more than a cheerful TikTok clip of a daughter and her youthful mother swaying to a catchy song. Millions watched. Thousands commented. For a moment, the Bukharis seemed like a family living a flawless dream. Online, Mahek Bukhari and her mother, Ansreen, looked perfect, stylish, confident, admired by their growing audience. But behind the synchronized choreographies, the bright smiles, something much darker is going on. It ended on a dark highway at 1:30 a.m., where two young men were chased at 160 kilometers per hour, rammed off the road, and left to burn alive, while the people responsible sped away without a single glance back. The shocking truth that followed would transform a rising TikTok star and her mother from internet darlings into key figures in one of the most disturbing ambush killings the United Kingdom has seen in years. Mahek Bukhari was 23 years old at the time. Her mother, Ansreen Bukhari, was 45. The two once appeared together in a charming dance video, moving in perfect sync to a catchy song. The clip went viral almost instantly. Comment after comment praised how youthful Ansreen looked, many insisting they appeared more like sisters than mother and daughter. That boost of attention brought Ansreen unexpected fame. She began showing up more often in Mahek's videos and live streams. During one live stream, Mahek and her mother were reading comments, chatting casually with viewers. Suddenly, a message popped up from a clearly fake account, telling Mahek to have her mother call him. Mahek laughed it off, but she didn't notice the sudden tension in her mother's expression. Moments later, Ansreen excused herself, slipped into the bathroom, and with trembling hands pressed her phone to her ear. She quietly begged the man on the other end to stop harassing her and to leave her daughter out of it. She warned that she would call the police. But the caller didn't care. He claimed he had already obtained her husband's phone number, threatened to send him explicit videos involving her. Ansreen's heart almost jumped out of her chest. She checked her husband's phone and saw the messages. Thankfully, he had ignored them, assuming they were just another spam attempt. The Bukhari family was well known online thanks to Mahek's growing success and the wholesome, religious family image she carefully built on TikTok. If this secret came out, it could destroy everything. Mahek's career, Ansreen's marriage, and their public reputation months earlier. It had all started in the most unexpected way. There was an app called Azar, where users could meet strangers around the world through random video calls. It exploded in popularity during the social distancing time when people were isolated and bored at home. One day, Ansreen's teenage niece came to visit. While Ansreen was busy with household chores, the girl sat in the living room chatting on Azar with a young man from the United Kingdom. proud of her famous family. She excitedly told him that her cousin was the well-known TikToker, Mahek, that she was currently staying at their house. To prove it, she turned the camera so he could see Ansreen sitting nearby. She explained that this was Mahek's mom, the one who appeared in all those viral dance videos. Ansreen smiled politely, waved at the screen, then went back to her tasks, not realizing that this innocent moment would open the door to a nightmare. Mahek wanted fame, not just in the United Kingdom, but internationally. She danced to viral songs, used every trending effect, and constantly searched for ways to boost her visibility. Soon, Mahek began involving her entire family, her brother, even her father. Although her father didn't fully understand the appeal of TikTok and looked a bit serious on camera, his presence added to the wholesome charm. Together, they projected the image of a perfect, loving family. Mahek presented herself online as a religious Muslim woman, often sharing posts about her faith, morals, and cultural beliefs. She frequently expressed her love for her mother, Ansreen, describing her as her best friend and most trusted confidant. However, behind this carefully constructed online persona, Mahek secretly desired to become a successful fashion influencer. She envisioned a glamorous life where she could display stylish outfits on Instagram and TikTok, receive complimentary clothing from popular brands, promote companies in her posts, and achieve a high-profile lifestyle through her social media presence. With 126,000 followers, Mahek had already secured several brand deals. She earned money through sponsored posts, events, and appearances across the United Kingdom. She promoted local restaurants, bars, especially shisha lounges, always with her mother by her side. Coming from a conservative family, it would have been improper for Mahek to go to such places alone. Beyond that, Ansreen genuinely was her closest companion. Mahek encouraged her mother to create her own social media presence, insisting that Ansreen's growing popularity could also bring in advertising income. Perhaps, deep down, this was the life Ansreen had secretly longed for. At 45, Ansreen worked as a managing director for a security company. As a teenager, she dreamed of becoming a flight attendant, but her parents arranged her marriage, expecting her to settle down quickly, start a family. She fulfilled that role dutifully. She loved her husband and children, but she had skipped an entire stage of life, the youthful freedom, experimentation, and excitement most people experience in their 20s. She went directly from being a teenager to being a wife, mother. From the outside, her life seemed ideal: a stable home, a devoted husband who supported the family, and grown children. But recently, she found herself drawn to the vibrant nightlife she encountered through Mahek's influencer events. The bars, the shisha lounges, the music, the fashion, the social scene. For the first time in decades, she felt seen and admired. After creating her own social media account, Ansreen began checking her messages regularly. One day, a particular message stood out. The sender's name was Saqib Hussein. Something about him seemed strangely familiar. Then she remembered. He was the same young man her niece had spoken to on a video chat during a recent visit. Soon, the two began exchanging regular messages. That quickly escalated into daily phone calls, sometimes 5 times a day, whenever Ansreen's husband wasn't home. Their conversations were light, playful, and flirtatious, filled with the kind of excitement usually felt by teenagers in a secret romance. No matter what Ansreen was doing, Saqib always seemed to be waiting on the other end of the line. Mahek knew her mother was talking to someone, but she assumed it was simply a friend. She never imagined it was an affair. Saqib was young, handsome, and enthusiastic. But most of all, he was completely infatuated with Ansreen. He told her he was 27, while she was in her mid-42s. The 17-year age gap didn't seem to bother him at all. For Ansreen, The attention from a much younger man was flattering and thrilling. In reality, Saqib had lied. He was only 18 when they began talking, but he crafted every part of his persona to look older, more mature, more desirable. He would suddenly appear at shisha lounges or bars where Mahek and her mother were filming promotions, paying for their drinks, food. He sent gifts to Ansreen's home, packages she had to open in front of her family while pretending she had ordered them herself. Their relationship then crossed the final line. Though they lived in different cities and had to avoid raising suspicion, whenever they met in hotels in Birmingham or London, their encounters became increasingly intimate. Even during video calls, the chemistry was undeniable. It was exhilarating, reckless, and fragile. An emotional tightrope with a deadly drop waiting beneath it. And neither of them understood how close they were edging toward disaster. It turned out that Saqib wasn't the first affair Ansreen had engaged in during her marriage. Years earlier, she'd had a relationship with another married man who also had children. They both understood the boundaries. It was physical, secret, and never meant to threaten their families. It was a shared escape from stress, nothing more. But with Saqib, everything was different. He wasn't married. He didn't have children. He was young, impulsive, obsessive, and completely in love with Ansreen. To him, she wasn't a distraction. She was the goal. After nearly 2 years, Ansreen finally decided the affair had to end. The guilt, the secrecy, the constant stress, it had become unbearable. She met Saqib at a hotel and told him she needed to focus on her marriage. She wanted to fix what she had broken. She had lived in fear for too long. They spent one final night together. But by the next morning, it was clear Saqib had no intention of letting her go. He called and messaged her relentlessly. 5, sometimes 10 times a day. He demanded to know what she was doing, where she was going, who she was with. Every attempt she made to distance herself only triggered more desperate behavior. And when she mentioned that her husband was beginning to suspect something, he tightened his grip. Saqib began sending her photos of expensive gifts. She begged him to stop, insisting she didn't want anything. But he ignored her. Whenever she refused to accept the deliveries, he exploded in anger. Finally, in December 2021, gathering every ounce of courage she had left, Ansreen ended things for good. She braced herself for insults, threats, endless phone calls. She expected all of it. But what came next was far worse. Saqib sent her explicit photos and videos they had filmed together. Then came the messages that, if she didn't respond, he would send everything to her husband or post it online. Her entire life, her marriage, her family's safety, her daughter's public career, lay in Saqib's hands. Ansreen felt trapped, convinced she had only one way out. At this same time, her daughter Mahek, now a well-known TikTok star, had no idea what was happening behind closed doors. She didn't know her mother was being threatened. In December 2021, crushed by fear and guilt, Ansreen finally confessed everything. She revealed the affair, the threats, the explicit videos, everything she had been hiding. She did it to unburden herself, but also because she desperately needed someone to help her. When Mahek heard the truth, she exploded. Mahek yelled at Ansreen because she had betrayed, put the family in danger, and risked ruining her social media career. But soon her fury turned towards Saqib. She paced the living room, shaking with anger. In her mind, he was the real threat, the person holding her family hostage, the person who could ruin her with a single tap of his phone. Mahek insisted she would sort Saqib herself. She told her mother she would get her friends involved, that they'd intimidate him until he backed off. She promised that after she was done, he would never dare say her mother's name again. Her first call was to her closest friend, 29-year-old Rekan Karwan. She told him she was being blackmailed, begging for his help and protection. Reckon didn't know Ansreen was involved. He believed Mahek was the victim. He agreed to mediate between Saqib and Mahek. When Reckon met with Saqib, the truth finally surfaced. Saqib wanted 3,000 British pounds. He claimed he had spent that much on gifts and hotels while he and Ansreen were together. Now he wanted his money back. Unless he was paid, he said, the explicit videos would be released. Mahek did not react with fear. She reacted with fury, and from that moment on, everything spiraled into a nightmare none of them could control. Now Mahek and her friends faced a problem. How could they deal with Saqib without exposing themselves to danger or to the police? After long discussions, they settled on a plan centered around a staged car confrontation. They contacted Saqib and arranged a meeting in a Tesco supermarket car park, promising to bring the full 3,000 British pounds. The meeting was set for 1:30 a.m., a time when the area would be completely deserted. The location was nearly halfway between the cities where Saqib and Ansreen lived. Saqib agreed. On 11 February 2022, Mahek, Ansreen, Reckon, and 5 other friends split into 2 vehicles, drove to the empty Tesco car park. They parked far from each other to give themselves room to maneuver once Saqib showed up. Initially, not everyone in the group knew the full extent of the plan. Reckon and another friend stepped out of the cars and disappeared into the shadows, creating the illusion that Mahek and Ansreen had come alone. Their original intent seems to have been to corner and assault Saqib right there in the car park. But the group hadn't accounted for one crucial variable. Saqib didn't come alone. He hated driving. So he asked friends to accompany him. Most refused. They didn't want to travel to another city in the middle of the night. Saqib was about to cancel the plan entirely until one friend, Hashim Ijazuddin, offered to come along. Hashim was the type who helped everyone. He had no idea Saqib was blackmailing someone. To him, it was simply a nighttime drive with music and conversation. When Hashim and Saqib arrived a little early, they immediately sensed something was wrong. Something about the empty car park, the parked vehicles, the atmosphere. It didn't feel safe. They didn't stop or get out. They drove a quick loop and exited the car park to avoid confrontation. But as soon as they pulled back onto the motorway, a blue Seat Leon slid in behind them. Seconds later, the Bucharest Audi followed. During the chase, Mahek called Saqib from her mother's phone and told him exactly what she planned to do. At 1:20 a.m., CCTV from a nearby petrol station captured 3 cars racing past. Hashim's silver vehicle in front, the blue Seat Leon behind it, and the Audi tailing the seat. All 3 were traveling at roughly 160 kilometers per hour. To anyone watching, it looked like a violent pursuit. Immediately after Mahek's threatening call, Saqib dialed 999. His voice was frantic as he told the operator that they were being chased by 2 cars trying to ram him off the road. The dispatcher, however, seemed skeptical. She repeatedly asked why he believed they were being followed. Terrified, Saqib explained that the people in the pursuing cars were wearing balaclavas, ski masks with eye slits. He said he feared for his life and for his friend Hashim, who was driving, but he couldn't give a precise location, only that they were on the A46. As the operator continued to ask questions, everything suddenly escalated. The blue seat slammed into the back of Hashim's car. The Audi boxed them in from the side. A loud crash echoed through the line, and the call abruptly ended. At 1:30 a.m., Hashim's car was forced off the road at high speed. It smashed into the central barrier, flipped over it, collided with a tree, split in half, and erupted into flames. The other 2 cars sped past before pulling into the next lay-by. CCTV captured 2 individuals stepping out, checking their vehicles for damage, and then calmly driving away in the opposite direction. From their car windows, all 8 people watched the inferno, consuming Hashim and Saqib's vehicle. Not one of them called emergency services. Not one tried to help. Later, it would emerge that Ansreen had collapsed in her seat, sobbing uncontrollably. While Mahek tried to comfort her, the two cars then parked in a nearby residential street. All passengers got out except one, Mohammed, who went straight home. The rest took a slow, hour-long walk around the neighborhood. In reality, they were practicing and aligning their cover stories in case the police called. Afterward, they returned to their cars and quietly drove home. Meanwhile, at the crash site, the fire burned with such intensity that firefighters couldn't extinguish it immediately. When they finally reached the mangled remains of the vehicle, they found the bodies of Saqib Hussain and Hashim Ijazuddin, both just 21 years old. Investigators later stated that the men had likely died upon impact, before the flames consumed the car. The force of the crash had been catastrophic. The car split completely in two, and the engine was thrown some distance away. Even if someone had called for help, there would have been no chance of saving them. Investigators quickly established that the car had not crashed on its own. CCTV from nearby businesses revealed a high-speed pursuit involving two vehicles chasing the silver Skoda containing Saqib and Hashim. Detectives also discovered Saqib's frantic emergency call placed just seconds before the fatal collision. It didn't take long for police to identify the pursuing cars and track them through the automatic number plate recognition system. Ansreen and Mahek hadn't even made it home before officers were already on their way to their address. The Audi involved in the chase, combined with the call Mahek made to Saqib during the pursuit, led police straight to the Bucharest front door. When officers knocked, it was Mahek's teenage brother who opened it. Half asleep, still in his pajamas. Before he even understood what was happening, they informed him he was under arrest for the murder of two people. Terrified, he protested. He didn't even have a driver's license. He insisted he hadn't gone anywhere that night and had been home the entire time. Officers soon realized their mistake. The phone number used to contact Saqib was registered under the son's name, not the mother's. They apologized and released him. Officers quickly realized they had the wrong person, apologized for the mistake, and let him go. Just as he exhaled and relaxed, he was hit with another bombshell. The car crash had been caused by his mother and sister. The fact was that his mother's phone number was registered in her son's name. Later that day, on 11 February 2022, officers returned to the Bukhari home to properly question Mahek and Ansreen. Both appeared calm, dressed in pajamas, as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Mahek immediately launched into a detailed but entirely fabricated explanation of her whereabouts the night before. She claimed she had been driving on the motorway and had witnessed the bizarre chase firsthand, almost becoming caught up in it herself. Her delivery was surprisingly smooth. Using confident gestures, she reenacted how the cars had swerved and accelerated around her. The only flaw in her story was that she portrayed herself and her mother as innocent bystanders. According to Mahek, she and Ansreen were simply driving their Audi when the car ahead suddenly sped up, lost control, crashed into the central barrier. She described seeing another car, a blue sedan, that appeared to be racing the silver vehicle. She claimed she had to slow repeatedly to avoid getting caught up in their reckless driving. Her mother supposedly warned her to keep her distance. Mahek said that when the crash happened, she noticed the blue sedan pull over briefly, so she assumed everything would be handled and continued driving. Ansreen, she said, urged her not to stop, insisting the drivers might be drunk and that it was unsafe. Meanwhile, Saqib's family told police he had been involved with an older woman he affectionately called Ansi. He had even introduced her to his sister. Yet both Mahek and Ansreen denied knowing Saqib at all. Ansreen had already scrubbed her phone, deleting every message, photo, and video that could expose their affair. But detectives accessed Saqib's cloud backups, where hundreds of images and videos documented the relationship in intimate detail. Investigators also pulled phone records showing constant communication between the drivers of the blue seat Leon and the Audi on the night of the crash. Crucially, they found a call made to Saqib moments before the fatal impact. Placed from Mahek's phone, the truth was closing in. Events unfolded rapidly. All 8 people who had been in the 2 cars that night were detained. The blue seat Leon had been driven by 21-year-old Raiz Jamal. Also in the vehicle were 21-year-old Natasha Akhtar, 21-year-old Sanaf Ghulam Mustafa, and 27-year-old Amir Jamal. In the Audi were 45-year-old Ansreen Bukhari, 23-year-old Mahek Bukhari, and 20-year-old Mohammed Patel. The Audi was driven by 28-year-old Rekan Karwan. All of them were charged with offenses relating to the deaths of Saqib Hussain and Hashim Ijazuddin. Yet every defendant denied having anything to do with the crash. The passengers in the blue seat insisted they were simply on their way to a friend's house to play Monopoly. They admitted they had seen something burning on the roadside, but claimed it was unrelated to them. Mahek continued clinging to her initial story, but eventually changed tactics. She finally admitted her mother had been having an affair, and that everything spiraled out of control when Saqib threatened to show up at the Bukharis home and expose everything to her father. Mahek said she only wanted to protect her mother. According to her, the plan that night had been to give Saqib the money he was demanding so that he would stop blackmailing them. She claimed she had asked Rekan to accompany them because she was afraid of going to another city alone with her mother. She insisted she had only planned to talk to Saqib, convince him to back off, and end the drama. As for the blue seat full of other people, Mahek said she hardly knew them. They were Rekan's friends, and she assumed he had invited them as extra protection. She insisted she had never imagined anyone planned violence. Desperate to regain credibility, Mahek pleaded with investigators to believe she was now telling the truth. She claimed her earlier lies were out of shame. Ashamed of her mother's affair with a much younger man and terrified that the truth would leak to the media. Then, in a stunning twist, she tried to convince detectives that Saqib had wanted to die and had deliberately caused the crash himself. Officers were stunned by her attempt to blame the victims. All 8 suspects were sent to trial. Only one would eventually walk free. The first trial descended into chaos. 7 defendants sat together in the dock, each offering their own version of the night. Some slightly different, others wildly contradictory. Prosecutors eventually decided to split the defendants into groups. Mahek, Ansreen, and the 2 drivers would be tried separately from the remaining friends. The prosecution believed that several of the passengers might not have understood the full plan and could not have influenced what happened. They may have simply gone out with friends, unknowingly ended up in a situation that turned deadly. Another major point of contention was the speed of the chase. Estimated at 160 kilometers per hour, the victim's actions also complicated the case. Toxicology reports showed cannabis in Hashim's system, and he had been driving at high speed. Defense teams seized on this immediately, arguing that the victim's own reckless behavior had caused the crash. They tried to paint Hashim as responsible for his own death. Then Saqib himself came under scrutiny. Evidence emerged that Ansreen was not the only woman he had harassed after being rejected. A woman unconnected to the case testified that she had met Saqib at a nightclub. He had begged for her phone number. At the time, she already had a boyfriend, but she gave the number to him just to get rid of him. Eventually, Saqib started flooding her with messages. He also called 15 to 20 times a day, threatening to smash her car or come to her house. The woman contacted local police 3 times because she was terrified of Saqib. Overall, this information painted Saqib in a very negative light. The jury also heard the threatening messages Saqib had sent to Ansreen, warning he would leak explicit videos and photos to her family and post them online if she refused to speak to him. Read aloud in court. They sounded chilling, but in reality, they were presented without context. No one knew what had triggered his outbursts. Was it calculated blackmail, emotional instability, a manipulative attempt to regain control of a relationship he could not let go of? Only Saqib himself could have explained the truth. But his life had already come to a violent end. Any trial is incredibly painful for a victim's family and friends. But for Hashim Ijazuddin's parents, the suffering was beyond anything they could have imagined. Their son had nothing to do with any of this. He had only agreed to help a friend by driving him to another city late at night. And that simple act of kindness cost him his life. Now, his grieving parents had to sit in court and listen as their son was accused of having cannabis in his system, as though that somehow justified what happened to him. Yet online, much of the public sympathy went toward the Bukhari husband and son, because throughout the trial, the family effectively collapsed. Ansreen's husband never visited her while she was in custody, though he did appear for certain parts of the proceedings, likely to support Mahik. For Mr. Bukhari, the worst part was the humiliating public exposure of his family's private life. In court, not only did details of Ansreen's affair with 21-year-old Saqib Hussain come to light, but her earlier infidelity, long before the relationship with Saqib, was also revealed. According to the prosecution, the tragedy was no accident. They argued that Mahek, Ansreen, and their friend, Rekan, had planned together how to get rid of Saqib. These three were, in the prosecution's view, the masterminds of the crime. They were the ones who lured Saqib to the Tesco car park under the pretense of paying him off. Whether they intended to ambush him there or had already decided to force his car off the road later, the result was the same. They knowingly placed two men in mortal danger. Pursuing a vehicle at 160 kilometers per hour and attempting to ram it could only be done with lethal intent. Lawyers painted Ansreen and Mahek as victims, terrified, cornered, and manipulated by a dangerous stalker. Mother and daughter insisted they only wanted to speak to Saqib that night. Nothing more. Of the 8 people involved, only 7 were arrested. 21-year-old Mohammed Patel, seated in the Audi that night, left the group immediately after the crash. His later release raised many questions among the public. Some believed he was innocent. Others suspected he had cooperated with police. Whatever the truth, Mohammed confirmed details consistent with Saqib's desperate emergency call, proving that Saqib were indeed being chased at high speed. All participants had worn balaclavas to hide their faces from CCTV. Rekan allegedly instructed the driver of the blue seat, Leon Reyes Jamal, to ram Saqib's Skoda from behind. Reyes later claimed he had been the last to join the group and knew nothing about the situation he was entering. He said he was terrified once he realized what was happening and fled at the first opportunity. Whether that was true remains uncertain, but his statements were crucial to the investigation. The remaining 5 defendants continued to insist on their innocence. They claimed they had no idea what was going on and believed they were simply out for a night drive before playing Monopoly. Each person had their own justification. Reyes Jamal, the driver of the blue seat, said he only wanted to scare the boys in the Skoda because one of them had blackmailed the women. But the situation spiraled out of control. Amir Jamal, another passenger, claimed he was under the influence of banned substances and had no understanding of what was happening. Natasha Akhtar said she was in love with the driver and didn't want to upset him by questioning his reckless driving. She argued that all boys drive like lunatics, and stressed that a prison sentence would end her dreams of becoming a criminal defense lawyer. Sanaf Ghulam Mustafa explained that his father was dying of cancer and he was his sole caregiver. He insisted he would never risk abandoning his father for the sake of women he barely knew, saying he only went out that night for fresh air and a brief escape from the emotional weight at home. After his father passed away, Sanaf was not even allowed to attend the funeral due to his bail conditions. Debate over each defendant's level of responsibility continues even today. But one thing is undeniable: every one of them was willingly involved in a high-speed, masked pursuit that ended in the deaths of 2 innocent young men. Whether they saw it as a twisted thrill, a late-night adventure, or simply followed the group without thinking, the moment they put on balaclavas and joined the chase, they implicated themselves in a crime that could end in tragedy. After numerous hearings, the jury finally withdrew to deliberate. They spent more than 28 hours examining every piece of evidence before returning with their verdicts. Ansreen Bukhari, Mahek Bukhari, Raiz Jamal, and Rekin Karwan were all found guilty of the murders of Saqib Hussain and Hashim Ijazuddin. Sentencing reflected the devastating impact of their actions. Mahek Bukhari received life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 31 years and 8 months. Ansreen Bukhari received life imprisonment, with a minimum of 26 years and 9 months. Raiz Jamal was sentenced to life, with a minimum of 33 years, including time added for driving without a license. Rekin Karwan received life, with a minimum of 26 years and 10 months. The remaining defendants in the 2 cars, Sanaf Ghulam Mustafa, Amir Jamal, and Natasha Akhtar, were convicted of manslaughter. Their sentences ranged from 11 to 15 years, reflecting the court's view that while they aided the pursuit, they were not the masterminds or primary aggressors. Mohammed Patel, the 8th person, was not charged, likely because his role was minimal and he left the scene immediately after the crash. A reckless adult woman, chasing youth and excitement, dragged her daughter and her friends into her personal crisis, triggering a chain of events that ruined several lives. What remains is heartbreak. Saqib Hussain, though far from perfect, did not deserve to die. Hashim Ijazuddin was simply a kind friend offering a ride, and he paid for that kindness with his life. Taking someone's life to hide your own mistakes is not only senseless, it is unforgivable.